The entity in the doorway. When I was about 19 years old, I went to visit my girlfriend Valerie. One night, it actually got pretty late, around 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock a.m. So that's when her parents decided to let me spend the night, but only if we promised not to lock the bedroom door, since we weren't married yet. She lived in a 2-bedroom, small, older house. There was a hallway in between both rooms with the restroom in the middle. We got ready to go to sleep, and I made my bed on the floor while Val was going to sleep in her own bed. I was laying on the floor right next to Val, with my head about a foot away from the bedroom door. After we pillow talked for about an hour, I noticed that she started to fall asleep. That's when I decided to go to sleep, and I began to slowly doze off. That's when I heard someone walking in the hallway towards the bedroom we were sleeping in. It was pitch dark in the room. They didn't have carpet in the room. Rather, it was wood panel floors, so I could hear the floor creaking. I figured it must be her parents checking to make sure we were not sleeping in the same bed together. Then the doorknob slowly turned and the door opened with a creaking noise. I kept my eyes closed, hoping that her parents would leave once they saw that I was asleep on the floor. I was surprised when the door stayed open. Whoever it was or whatever it was only inches away from my head. I was beginning to get worried and confused because whoever it was not leaving the doorway. I felt as if I was being watched. When 10 minutes passed, that's when I could no longer fake my sleep. I was beginning to truly get scared. Then something happened that I will never forget till this day. I heard a low, long growl. I could feel my heart beating through my body. The room got extremely cold at that moment. Then finally, after about 15 minutes of torture, the bedroom door slowly shut. It took me about an hour or so just to fall asleep. The following morning, I asked Valerie's parents if they checked on us the previous night, and they said they never left their bedroom. That's when I got goosebumps all over my body, and I knew it was something paranormal. To this very day, I cannot explain what happened that night, and what made that growl, and what was it doing the whole time it was standing in the doorway. Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, chased by a UFO. In 1965, me and my father were coming home from our Wednesday church service. We were driving down a long stretch of road. We were headed to our house in the country area. It was about 10 o'clock p.m. We were pretty tired and were just trying to make it home. While we were driving, I happened to look up and noticed a flickering red and yellow light in the sky. I looked harder, and that's when I noticed it was slowly moving. It was about 2 miles away or so. I showed my dad, and he gazed up at it, and we were wondering what it could be. I told him it looked like a UFO. That's when it quickly vanished. But about 5 minutes later, while we were driving on the same road, we noticed the same light flickering, but this time it was in the middle of the road. I couldn't believe my eyes what I was seeing. It was just sitting there. As we drove closer, our jaws dropped in amazement because it was clear to us that it was an actual UFO. A real UFO with the brightest lights I've ever seen, circling around the spacecraft. We were parked there in front of the UFO, not moving at all. I told my dad, what do we do? Because it was literally blocking us from getting to our house. After sitting there for a couple of minutes and not saying anything, my father did the unthinkable, something that I will never forget to this day. He slammed on the gas straight towards the UFO. The car went full throttle and drove straight towards the spacecraft that was just sitting there in the middle of the road. I thought we were going to crash and die. Just seconds before hitting the UFO, it launched up in the air and took off. I do not know why my dad did what he did. The truth is, we could have literally died that night. As we were racing home and were almost about 2 minutes away from our house, we noticed the same UFO popped up right behind us and was following us. Then it took off in front of us and left us behind. As soon as we made it home, we noticed the UFO was hovering right above our house. We were wondering, how did the UFO know that we lived there? Even though we lived in the country, there were other houses in the area. My dad told me to stay in the car. As he got out of the car, he slammed the door and ran into the house to get his gun. I was petrified as I was staring up at the UFO. While my dad was inside the house, I rolled down my window and I looked around, and that's when I saw 3 or 4 human-like creatures standing around the bushes that surrounded our house. My father came outside with his rifle and started shooting at the UFO. That's when I got out of the car and told him that there were creatures around the bushes that surrounded our house. While my father was still shooting at the UFO, it flew directly up into the air and vanished. We rushed inside and locked the doors. My father called the sheriff's department to tell them what had just happened that night. But that same night, we had to make a statement on what happened regarding the UFO. To this day, I do not know why the UFO chose to mess with us. At night, I always wonder, what if those creatures would have gotten a hold of us? Or what if the UFO would have actually attacked us? This I may never ever know. Scary True Paranormal Story number 3. The Club. This story is one of my own, and it is a very scary, true story. My dad told me this a long time ago, and this story has never left my mind, as it is one of the scariest things I have ever heard. This took place in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1950s. My dad said his dad, my grandpa, played accordion as a side job and was pretty good at it. He was outside his house playing the accordion around evening time when a man came by and introduced himself as John. He said he was in a band and played nightly at a nightclub in Corpus Christi. He said that my grandfather played really good accordion music and it sounded really nice. He wanted to know if my grandpa wanted to come out to the nightclub the following night and that he would also get paid for it. My grandfather was really excited about the job offer and agreed to it right away. The man told him to make sure he's there at 2 a.m. sharp. My grandfather found it pretty strange that he had to be there at the club so late, but he didn't ask any questions. The following night, my grandfather showed up to the dance hall exactly at 2 a.m. He was dressed really nice and had his accordion strapped around him. He said that as soon as he walked into the nightclub, he felt a strange, weird feeling as if everyone was looking at him. Everyone was dressed in suits and tuxedos. Music was playing and everyone was drinking and having a really good time dancing. He made his way to the side of the stage, and there he saw John, the man that invited him to come to the club. John saw my grandfather and walked up to him and asked him if he knew what song they were playing at the moment. My grandfather said yes, he did know the song and knew how to play it. So my grandfather got on stage and began to play his accordion. But he said about after 2 minutes of playing the song, he noticed that something didn't look right with John, the singer that was on stage at the time. He looked down at John's feet while he was singing, and to his shock and horror, John had goat feet. After seeing this, his whole body went cold. He quickly looked at the other band members and noticed that they had chicken feet. He stopped playing the accordion and looked around at the people dancing, and they all had animal feet and legs. Some people had goat feet, while others had chicken and pig feet. My grandfather was petrified. He couldn't move. Just then, he said the music stopped and everyone noticed that he knew how they looked. Everyone stopped dancing and they all stopped moving. They all looked at him with straight serious faces. That's when he jumped off the stage and ran towards the door. He said he could hear everyone laughing at him. He finally made it out of the dance hall and ran all the way straight home. When he got home, he told my grandmother everything that had happened to him. The following morning, he went back to the club with some friends to show them where all this took place, and to his surprise and horror, the doors and windows were boarded up. The place looked run down and was falling apart. My grandfather was confused. He later found out that there was a fire years prior that burned down the dance hall, taking the lives of everyone that was there that dreadful night.
The House of Nightmares.
I grew up with my parents separated. I would have to go back and forth between my mom and dad's house. My mom lived in a small town in Texas. It was a 2-story house. My dad was super sick, so my twin brother and I went to go stay with my mother until he recovered. I didn't have a bedroom of my own. My brother Thomas and I had to share a room upstairs with my half-brother Danny. My mom and stepfather stayed in the master bedroom down the hall. Rather than share a room with my brothers, I decided to sleep downstairs on the living room couch. This is where things began to get really scary and creepy. One night during the summer, we got home late. Everyone was getting ready for bed, and I settled down on the couch, and I waited for everyone to go into their rooms so I could finally get some rest. I eventually dozed off. All I remember is I woke up in the middle of the night, and it felt like I was being pulled up from the couch. Panic took over, and I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed as if a heavy weight was on top of my chest. As I struggled in vain, a cold hand covered my mouth, and I couldn't breathe. I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, the weight lifted, and I shot up off the couch and took a deep, gasping breath. After composing myself, I began to cry until I fell back to sleep. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. For all I knew, it was just a violent nightmare. Now, fast forward a few months later, and there was a really bad storm going on. I was listening to the rain hit the AC unit outside the living room. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was beginning to drift off to sleep. From my position on the couch, I could see the kitchen. There was a small sunroom with our washer and dryer next to the back door. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see something darting back and forth quickly between the kitchen and the sunroom. It was a dark mass that almost resembled a human, but it had a transparent body. It was quickly pacing between the sunroom and the kitchen. In complete horror and shock, I remember laying there as still as a statue, watching this thing go back and forth. I slowly pulled the covers up to the bridge of my nose, terrified to take my eyes off the figure. A couple of minutes go by, and it just vanishes into thin air. To get to the stairwell from downstairs, you have to go through the kitchen, and even with that thing being gone, I wasn't going to take any chances of trying to go up the stairs and wake up my mom. I ended up pulling the covers completely over my head and fell back to sleep. The next morning, I questioned everyone in the house if they were awake the night before walking around downstairs. My mother just shrugged it off and assumed that I had a really bad nightmare. Not much happened after that. However, my mother ended up passing away, but my father was still sick at the time, so Thomas and I had to stay with my grandmother for the time being. After my mother's funeral, we moved from Texas to Iowa to stay with my aunt. As if the story couldn't get any more tragic, my dad succumbed to his illness and passed away as well. My stepdad was still living in the same house, and we would go see him from time to time. When we would come visit, these strange occurrences began happening all over again. Maybe it was just me, but for some reason, the house seemed darker than ever. It felt like something was constantly watching me. We stayed the night with my stepfather during Christmas vacation. Before my mom passed away, she bought this nice, soft chair. It was very comfortable, and I slept in it the first night back. My brother and stepdad stayed awake playing cards all night. While I was asleep in the chair, I was awoken by Thomas. He kept shaking me. I asked him, "What's the matter?" His eyes were huge, and his face was completely pale. He said, "Rachel, listen. While I was getting ready to sleep, I looked over and I saw your hair. It was floating up in the air as if somebody was holding it and braiding it." After he said this, I quickly felt my hair, and I got chills from head to toe. I got off the chair and ran to the other side of the room. I looked in the mirror, and half of the front of my hair was braided. I shared the couch with my brother that night, but I still couldn't sleep all night. A couple of weeks later, we went back to visit my stepdad and uncle, and they were cleaning up the front yard. They found one of my old teddy bears buried under some leaves, and they decided to wash it up and give it back to me because the bear was a gift from my mother. She bought it for me many years ago. I was so happy to have it back, even though the buttons didn't work anymore. I would still press the main button multiple times a day, hoping and praying that it would work again. One day, my stepdad, Joe, took us back to my grandma's house. When we got there, he opened the trunk to grab our bags. That's when the bear activated and began playing its little original tune. The tune started off with its original slow tune. However, as it went on, it became a distorted, drowning sound. It slowed down and then eventually stopped. It was creepy, but I brushed it off thinking that it was just the old damaged wiring. However, the bear would turn on and off for the rest of the night, playing the same drowning tune. Now, what I'm about to tell you, in my opinion, is the most haunting thing that can happen to a human being. During the early morning hours, I was laying in my bed when I was awoken by a crackling voice coming from my teddy bear. To my horror and surprise, it said my name, Rachel. It was on the floor near the feet of my bed. I could not see it. I could only hear it. I waited, hoping that nothing else would happen. That's when I felt something slowly get on my bed. I quickly looked at the spot near my feet, and nothing was there. Yet I could see the imprints of a pair of small, childlike feet. I pulled my legs back. It just stood there at the end of my bed. I balled up and began crying and praying for it to go away. I then felt it leap off the bed, and 3 seconds later, my door opened. I don't know who opened my door. That morning when I got up, I tossed it into the garbage. My stepfather ended up being deported back to Europe, and we never returned to that house again. The house was eventually torn down years later. I was happy to see it go. I really wish I could forget about that haunted house and bury it in the past and move on with my life. But it will forever live on in my nightmares.
The aggressive entity.
This happened back in 2007. I was around 9 years old. I had never really experienced anything that can be considered paranormal in my house. But on one lonely night, that would all change. It was around midnight when I happened to wake up as usual. My bedroom door was open with the hallway light turned on. When I turned over and opened my eyes, I saw something. It was a dark, faceless figure looming in the corner of my room. I didn't know what to think or do. Upon seeing this, I was more curious than anything, trying to figure out what it wanted. The tall figure continued to linger around and just stared at me. Looking back, I can honestly say that I wasn't experiencing sleep paralysis. This seemed far too real to even be a dream. I decided to slowly turn around and face the wall. I just covered myself up with a blanket and closed my eyes. The next morning, I decided not to tell my parents about the dark figure. They were extremely religious, and honestly, I didn't want to scare them. After a while, I ended up telling my mom about it. Luckily, she took it pretty well. Instead of flipping out on me, she told me she had also witnessed something similar. But her encounter was much more disturbing than mine. According to her, a tall dark figure also appeared to her in the middle of the night. She tried to wake up my father, but he remained asleep. Suddenly, the tall dark figure moved in and began to choke her. She began to pray out loud, and the dark figure eventually loosened its grip and backed away. It then disappeared. It was only after that it was gone, and my father woke up. I think the entity also attacked me as well, but in a different way. Because ever since I had that encounter, scary things have happened to me over the years. I am now 23 years old, and I still live in that same haunted hell house. Thankfully, I have never experienced anything like that ever since, and I can only speculate as to what the dark, tall figure was and what its intentions really were.
The new house.
I'll start off by saying that I don't live with my family. I'm currently renting a house a half a mile away from them. My mom and my brother live in a subdivision, and my dad is currently working abroad. My brother has a mental disorder, which can make him unpredictable sometimes, and he's still in high school, which also further complicates things. Last year, when my family moved into that house, my mother began experiencing unnatural paranormal things. Before she moved in, she decided to visit and clean up the house with two of her acquaintances. While they were there cleaning up, they found these weird red triangle pentagrams under the rugs. At first, they forgot about it, but my mother suspected that something wasn't quite right. When the pentagrams were removed, she had this inexplicable feeling that they were making a huge mistake. At that exact moment, when they were removed, the ceiling fans began to turn on and off by themselves. One of my mother's friends was an experienced painter, and he was left alone to paint the walls while my mom went for a food run. When she got back, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. She then texted him to let him know that she was outside waiting. Suddenly, she received a reply from him that just said, "You need to wait." My mom was taken back by the rude and abrupt message, but she figured that he may have been in the bathroom or something. After a couple of minutes, she knocked on the door again, and her friend eventually opened the door. When it came time to leave, she casually asked her friend if he didn't hear her when she was knocking on the door earlier. She also mentioned the text message that he had sent her. But the scariest part was he said he never sent a text message at all, and that he couldn't even hear her knocking because the music was blasting from his phone. This gave my mother the creeps. The next encounter happened right after the house was done being remodeled. My mother brought an acquaintance to help her clean up the house. They couldn't get the front door to open. They both pushed on the door as hard as they could when suddenly there came 3 knocks from the other side, and the door slowly opened by itself. They then searched the entire house, but no one was there. We found out from some neighbors that the family who lived there before didn't stay there very long either, because of a series of bizarre and unexplainable occurrences. After my mom and brother moved in, the supernatural events just worsened. There has been numerous attempts to deal with these restless spirits in the house, even inviting some local pastors over to bless the home. I was and am still worried about my brother. Whatever resides in that house has seemed to take a special interest in him, and he can hear his name being called out, beckoning to him. The other things that they have been experiencing are lights flickering on their own. Uncontrollable random knocking can be heard on the roof, and scratch marks have appeared on the walls. My mother has reached out to random people that can help, but nothing seems to work. She has now reached her breaking point and plans on moving out of that hell house. I just hope it's not too late for them. Their departure may trigger whatever's targeting my brother. It might just stop toying around with him and finally make its move.
The Haunted Room.
This happened in 2014, the year my daughter was born. It all began when we first moved into our house, which was built in the early 2000s. I was still pregnant at the time. While moving in, I noticed that the light in our daughter's room would be left on when many times we switched it off. I brushed it off as an accident or maybe an electrical problem until a few months later, after my daughter was born. We settled into our new home and made the room above the garage our hangout spot. One day, while my husband watched our 4-month-old daughter, he told me while he was in the rocking chair, he thought he saw me making my way to the garage really slow. He said he felt as if something was off. He called out my name, but he said I didn't turn around. He distinctively remembered seeing my dark brown hair. When he got up and went to the garage, there was no one there. He checked the upstairs hangout room, but again, no one was there. This really creeped us out, but somehow we were able to move past it. However, when our daughter had to have surgery 6 months later, our friend volunteered to house sit for us while we were in the hospital. He had been resting on the futon in the hangout room when he felt something aggressively hitting the futon mattress. Again, we never told him about our experiences in the house, but our heart sank when he messaged my husband asking us if our house was haunted. With everything going on with our daughter at the time, the last thing we wanted to hear was confirmation that our house was haunted. From that point on, whenever I was in the hangout room, I felt this unnerving sensation you get when you're being watched. I always had that feeling only when I was near that room. Sometimes I would be in the garage doing something and have a glance up to see the closet door in the hangout room cracked open, even though I vividly remember closing it. Small things like this may not sound too alarming or scary, but in the back of my mind, I knew that there was an unwelcomed presence in my house. I imagined that something was just behind that closet door staring right at me. We had to deal with that dark presence until the day we moved out of there. Thankfully, we haven't seen or felt anything ever since then.
A house in Texas.
Hi, my name is Jesse, and I have lived in Texas for most of my life until now. Growing up there wasn't exactly ideal, and I didn't have the best relationship with my parents either. I pretty much dreaded coming home from school every day. There were so many scary things going on at home. I'm going to share with you a series of strange events that happened to me when I was growing up. First of all, when I was about 6 years old, back then I used to play with the flashlight in the dark without a care in the world. However, on this night when I pointed my flashlight at the wall besides my bed, I saw something horrific. There was a shadow figure standing in the doorway. Naturally, I immediately pointed my light toward the figure, but the light was not able to illuminate it. At the time, I really didn't understand. As I lowered the flashlight, I could see the figure's rough outline. It seemed to have a dark outline. Just then, it suddenly started moving towards me. I was absolutely terrified. Seeing this thing as an adult would be terrifying. How much more as a kid? I didn't know how to process it. The last thing I remember doing was turning off the flashlight and running into my parents' room. I still don't know how I made it past the shadow of terror. Of course, my mom didn't believe me, and even as a kid, I knew that I couldn't go to my parents with stuff like this. A few years later, I was in middle school and I was having a sleepover at my place with a friend. We went to the garage to grab some snacks and drinks after watching a movie. It was really late, so it was pretty dark. Once we entered, I sensed something was watching us. "I think we should get out of here," my friend said. My friend could also feel the unwelcomed presence. We quickly grabbed our stuff and were about to exit the garage when I pointed my flashlight near the mattresses that were leaning against the wall to the left. That's when we saw something quickly duck behind the mattresses to avoid the light. It was also that dark figure that I had saw before. We immediately shut the door and locked it. We then sat back down in the living room. We asked ourselves, what the hell did we just witness? I looked over to the clock and it was exactly 3:03 a.m. The last encounter was a week after my grandmother had passed away. She lived with us at the time. I remember that I went to the living room to use the computer and chat online. After a while, I heard a door open. I assumed that it was just my mom or dad using the bathroom. 15 minutes later, I got that strange feeling, the same feeling I felt the night my friend slept over. I got up and walked past the kitchen and dining room table and peeked into my grandmother's room, which was connected to the hallway. The door was slightly open. A dreadful feeling formed in the pit of my stomach. Something told me that if I didn't close that door, something scary would happen to me. So I quietly walked down the hallway to my grandmother's room. I was petrified as I quickly closed the door. I made it back to the living room where I stayed until the sun came back up. I'm so glad that I got out of that house and I'm now living with my boyfriend. Who knows what else would have happened if I stayed there?
The woman in a white dress.
Hi, my name is Catherine, and this happened in 2012 in El Paso, Texas. When I was 20 years old, I was working as a supervisor at a store, and I got off of work late, around 3 o'clock a.m. I got into my car and I took the usual way home, which was down a dark, long, quiet back road that led all the way back to my house. Everything was going as usual until I spotted a figure. A figure walking in the distance. As I drove closer to it, it appeared to be a woman walking alongside the road dressed in all white. Upon seeing the woman, I got goosebumps going all the way down to my legs. Seeing the woman walking all by herself, I started to feel a little creeped out. At this point, I was really close to her, but I still had not seen her face yet. As I approached even closer, I got a better look at her since she was walking right beside the driver's window. She had long, black, messy hair that was blocking most of her face. She appeared to be barefoot. I was petrified. Then, as I drove exactly parallel to her, she turned towards me and I was finally able to see her face. There was no face, no mouth, or no eyes. It was just a pale face. I floored it, and the second I passed her, my worst nightmare came to life as the woman began running right beside my window. My heart was racing. I pressed down on the accelerator as much as I possibly could, but the terrifying woman kept pace with my car, never leaving the window. My mind could not process what was happening. I started praying out loud and tried my hardest not to look out the window or to pay attention to my peripheral vision. I didn't want to see her, although I could see that she was looking straight into my window. Eventually, the woman vanished from view. I then looked into my rearview mirror to see the white figure just standing there watching me until I was out of sight. I finally made it home sobbing and running into my husband's arms. I told him everything that happened, and to my surprise and horror, he said that he had once taken that same back road home one night and also saw a woman with long black hair wearing a white dress walking alongside the road, but for whatever reason, she didn't chase after him. I still have no idea who or what that woman is. I can only guess that it was a ghost of a woman that died alongside that dark road. What I do know is that I'm extremely lucky to have escaped her clutches. I never go down that road, and whoever happens to drive down that road at night alone, may God be with them.
The Lonely Drive.
So, my mother told me this story many years after it happened. To this day, I remember everything she said. My mother never lies, so I can assure you this is 100% true. My dad was a truck driver at the time. He would only drive around our home state of Texas, where we're from. And during the summertime, it was extremely busy for him. This happened in the late 1980s, and while he was on the road working in Texas, my mother said that when this happened, he was driving south on 77. He was getting pretty sleepy, and that's when he pulled his rig into the parking lot of a truck stop. He got off of his truck, and he started walking into the on-site convenience store when he noticed a young woman in her 20s. She looked really pretty and was wearing a tank top with shorts. She was also carrying something in her hands. After my father finished his business in the store, he headed back to his truck. But as he got in, he was shocked to see that the woman was sitting in the passenger seat of his truck. Again, he had no clue who this woman was or how she got past his locked door. My father never left the doors of his truck unlocked and was normally a secure person with most of his things. She just sat there staring at him, not saying a word. He wanted to walk over to the passenger side door, open it, pull her out, and leave, but for some reason he decided against it. So, my dad, against his better judgment, turned his rig on and drives off with the woman still in his passenger seat. After about 5 minutes of driving in silence, he decided to make a conversation with her. He asked her name, but again, she remained silent. As they continued down the highway, he then said that he was having lustful thoughts, and I'm sure it had been a while since he had last seen my mother. He must have thought, out there in the rural Texas roads, who would find out? That's when my father made a decision that will forever haunt him. He slowly placed his hand on her thigh, right above her knee. As soon as he touched her, the woman turned from a gorgeous young woman into some kind of monster. Her face became rugged, and her eyes were now black. A putrid stench then filled the inside of the rig. That's when this demonic creature let out a terrifying growl that sent chills through my father's body. My father quickly turned away from her and managed to bring his rig to a complete stop on the side of the road. As the truck came to a halt, my dad opened his door and jumped out of the truck. After taking a few minutes to compose himself and allow his breathing to return to normal, he looked back at his truck, and the demonic woman who was sitting in the passenger seat had completely vanished. He was now alone on the road. He began praying out loud, begging God to please rebuke the evil spirit. He eventually got into his truck and drove off. The woman never returned, however. It was a while before the lingering stench in the truck would go away. When my father got home from that trip, he was so scared that my mother would not forgive him for his unfaithful decision. He told her everything and blamed himself for having impure thoughts, and perhaps that's why he attracted the evil spirit in the first place. I know many might say that people cheat on their partners all the time, and nothing like this ever happened to them. I can't explain why. I only know what happened to my father on that dark, lonely road in Texas. When I was older, I was very curious and brought it up to my father. I asked him, "Did that really happen to you?" He didn't say a word. He just nodded his head up and down.
The Beast.
I'll start off by saying that I've always believed in the paranormal. The paranormal encounter that I'm about to tell you was unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life. It was the summer of 2010. My nephew, who was around the same age as me, along with my friends Tim and John, were all hanging out at my house for a sleepover. We were watching the movie The Exorcist, and It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. When the movie was done, I told everybody that I was too tired to stay up any longer, and I was going to crash out in the living room. After grabbing a pillow and blanket from my bedroom, I proceeded to turn off all the lights and lay on the couch. After about a minute or two, I fell asleep. I then woke up and all the lights were on in the living room, and I asked if anyone was there. I couldn't go back to sleep with all the lights on, so I got up and looked around. What I confronted that night still gives me chills and petrifies me to this day. A dark, malevolent presence revealed itself to me. It seemed to have a half-goat, half-human appearance. The lower half was a goat body, while the middle was a human body with a goat head. Now this is where things get really scary for me. I speak, read, and write Assyrian, which is a modern-day form of ancient Aramaic, spoken by the Jews in Jesus' day. It began speaking to me in ancient Aramaic. I knew enough to recognize the dialect, but I couldn't understand what it was saying to me. The thing then pointed to my room down the hall. I began making my way towards my bedroom door. It was as if I was in a trance. When I got to my room, I opened the door. At first I saw nothing but red. Eventually, a vision of my nephew's dead corpse appeared to me. In my shock and horror, I screamed a curse word in ancient Aramaic, and to this day, I don't know what it meant, or how I was able to say it. But within seconds, I woke up in the kitchen, and all the lights were off. I was gripping a sharp object tightly in my hand. I ran into my bedroom yelling hysterically, waking up all my friends and my mother who was down the hall. After explaining to everyone what I had saw, I started shaking and crying like a frightened child. My mother, who was a deeply religious person, blessed the home after she heard my experience. I had lucid dreams before, but nothing to this extent of what happened that dark night.
The roof entity.
Most of my life, I've grown up on farms up in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere. We were accustomed to not having access to the internet or TV, and even cell phones. I like to think of my family as the last true generation before the internet age. But honestly, it wasn't really all that bad outside of the long, boring summer days where we would be practically cooked alive out in the fields. We lived in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee, and it definitely produced some pretty interesting experiences. This story starts off like many normal days. It was a typical Friday night. My brothers and I were home alone, and seeing how there wasn't much to entertain us, we began playing Manhunt. Most of the time, we wanted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For a bit more context, our cabin was situated on top of a steep hill that had a long winding driveway running down it. Our cabin also had a basement level. The main level was where most of the house was, and the upstairs only had my room. We also had a back deck that was elevated about 12 feet in the air, so it was really pitch black outside, and going out further than our front porch at night wasn't really something we normally did. But with what little room that we had to play with at this point, I had the bright idea to wander outside and hide on the roof to make the game more interesting. This was one of the biggest regrets in my life. At first, everything seemed fine. It was rather cold out that night, as it was nearing fall, and the weather was just starting to change. There was a slight breeze in the air. See, after a few minutes of just sitting up there on the roof, I felt that something was off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and other insects when I realized that all of a sudden the noises suddenly and completely stopped. This seemed very odd to me, being as naive as I was at the time. I didn't realize that this only meant something bad was going to happen. I didn't seem to hear anything aside from the slight breeze from the leaves. Then, as quickly as a silence came, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof at the time, making it very easy to hear when things would hit it. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite side of the roof. I looked over, but I couldn't see anything. This, of course, left me rather unnerved. My first thought was to get down from the roof before going into a full-blown panic. I remember it couldn't possibly be my brothers messing with me. They would have given up looking for me by now. I opened up the window to my bedroom and called for my brothers. They both ran up the stairs, shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. When my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if they had been messing with me while I was on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof. Everything went quiet around us once again. At this point, I was already on edge. We heard what sounded like pounding at the far end of the roof in the opposite direction of where we were standing. After what I think was about 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it suddenly charged us. At least I think it did. It sounded like a pair of hooves stomping on the metal roof. But the only issue was we couldn't see anything. Aside from us, the entire roof was clear, but somehow we could hear these stomping footsteps. It quickly began running circles around us. I held my arms out to try and see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. And the strangest part of all was that we could feel the vibration of the footsteps all around us, but we could not feel anything in the air. The entity circled us for what seemed like many minutes, but was probably no more than 60 seconds. It suddenly stopped circling us, and we could hear the steps trail off the roof and disappear. We quickly ran back inside and locked all the windows and doors. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, freaked out as hell.
My mom's doppelganger.
I have an open mind, but I don't buy into things that easily. Most things that happen, I blame on my mind, playing tricks on me, or sleep deprivation, or simply the fact that it could be a mental illness. There is one moment though, or I suppose a few moments, that have been on my mind for some time now. While I was in the shower one day, and as water poured over my head, I heard my brother yell my name. Stacy. Stacy. The second time was louder than the first, as if something was wrong. I could have sworn I heard my dog barking as well at the same time. Annoyed but concerned, I got out and cracked the door open, then called back to him, but after waiting a few seconds there was no response. I quickly dried myself off and put on my robe, then headed downstairs asking what he needed. However, I still got no response. My dog was on her bed, fast asleep, and my brother was nowhere to be found. I looked out the window, and their car wasn't even there. This wasn't the first time my mind has decided to play these annoying games, so I didn't really think much of it. I've had auditory hallucinations before, none to that degree, but maybe they're getting worse, I thought. That's my way of trying to reason with myself, and it worked. The next time that I heard my brother yell my name calling for me loudly, I thought I was genuinely going crazy. I decided to bring it up to my brother while playing Borderlands one night. We talked about our mental health a lot because our parents don't believe in therapy, so we kind of became each other's safe haven. I explained everything that's happened over the past month, and instead of giving advice or sympathizing like he usually does, he just gets really quiet for a second until he says that he's been having the same experiences as me. Except it's been our mom yelling his name, but she's never even home when it happens. He goes to check and no one's there. This was about a month ago or two, but he also thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It seemed after that talk things began to stop. I didn't hear anything for almost 3 weeks, but then something happened that I'll never forget to this very day, and I will probably never have an explanation for what it was. I was sitting in my bed, in my room, scrolling through Instagram, when my mom starts aggressively calling my name from downstairs. I've never heard her voice before. It was always my brother's, so I didn't even think anything weird of it. I was about to get up and see what she wanted when suddenly my mom burst through the door asking me what I wanted. I didn't know what to say, but I could tell that she was annoyed by the look she gave me. She asked me again what I wanted, and I just shook my head trying to understand what was going on. Then she angrily sighed and said not to yell her name while she's making dinner, and she walked out, leaving the door open. Still in shock, I got up to close the door, but as I walked across the room, my heart stopped when I came to the realization, and I immediately ran over to the window and looked at my driveway. My mom was at work, and the car wasn't even there. I locked my door to my room and jumped on my bed. Again, there was banging on my door. I sat on my bed crying as I called my brother. I was absolutely petrified and wanted to get out of the house, but couldn't even get myself to go downstairs alone, knowing that whatever that thing was out there. My brother didn't pick up as he was at work, so I was left stuck there. I ended up locking myself in my small bathroom while I waited for either my brother or my mom to get home from work, though I knew it would be hours. Thankfully, nothing else happened until my mom got back home. I told my brother that night, and he said he never had anything like that happen to him that bad. To this day, I still have no answers as to what I was hearing and seeing, but honestly, I'm writing this and sharing it to everyone just to be able to forget about it and move on.
Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, my childhood home.
This occurred when I was about 8 years old. My childhood home had a lot of issues with its past. A lot of deaths happened in the house prior to my family moving in. Most recently, the people that were renting it out to my mom and stepdad didn't want to live there because their son decided to opt out of life. And before that, a few murders even happened at the house. We didn't know the details, but that's what the landlord told us. I was young when my mom met my stepdad, and shortly after they met, they moved in together. My paranormal experiences didn't come until my baby sister came along, and that's when everything started. The house had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share a room with my baby sister, Rye. My little sister would never stop crying, and when I was young, I absolutely could not stand her. I remember this one night that I will never forget. She was crying for hours, and all of a sudden, she completely stopped. The room was dark, but I had a nightlight, so I could see a little around the room. I looked over, and I saw this shadowy figure hovering over her crib. It didn't move much, but when it did, it was slow and misty. I was petrified and hid under the covers until I eventually fell asleep. I told my parents the next day. They thought it was just my imagination. This happened so many more times of just waking up and seeing the figure by my sister's crib. It was nowhere else in the room. After a while of complaining about it, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room with my mom, while my stepdad slept in my room, but a lot more continued to happen. Shortly after I started seeing this figure, my stepdad lost his job. He was a hardworking man, so it really shocked my mom when it happened. He went through a rough depression because he really loved his job, and losing it must have been really hard on him. I remember him sitting on the couch all day, every day, just watching TV. One day, when I got home from school, I came in and saw him sitting on the couch, and a dark figure was standing right behind him. I remember it so clearly, just standing behind the couch. I didn't know what to do, so I just began to cry. My stepdad got up really quick and took me to the room to calm me down. When my mom came home, I told my parents that night of what I saw. Again, my stepdad seemed disinterested, but my mom seemed a little sympathetic. But no one really believed me. After that, there were a few good weeks where nothing happened, followed by weeks of this figure hanging around, usually either by Rye or my stepdad. Some nights, when I slept in my room, I'd hear a voice. It was a woman's voice. It was real deep, just talking to Rye. I never understood the words coming from it, but it terrified me every time. As Rai got older and began to walk and talk, I noticed she spent a lot more time in that room talking to her so-called friend, the Dark Shadow. I knew what it was. The more this figure seemed to hang around, the worse the emotions in the house got. My sister would seem to never talk to anyone else. My mom had so much anger inside of her, and my stepdad was always depressed, and I was alone all the time. Then my parents started fighting all the time, screaming things at each other. My mom hated my stepdad for not keeping down a job, and my stepdad was just a depressed mess. They seemed to fight every single night, and every night it got worse. While in my room, I even heard my stepdad telling my mom to put the knife down. But the worst time of all was when I was in the living room watching TV. It wasn't that late, maybe 8:30 p.m. or so, and my stepdad was asleep on the couch while my mom was in her room. I was starting to get tired, and I turned off the TV and walked upstairs to my room. At the top of the stairs, though, I started to hear whispering, followed by speaking back to the whispers. The door was cracked open a few inches, and I slowly walked over to look inside. Just a couple of steps away from the door, I walked over to the door and I looked inside, and that's when I saw a figure, and that's when I could see Rai next to this figure, as if it was trying to lead her somewhere. I screamed, and instantly the door slammed by itself. I just stood there screaming and crying before my mom rushed out of the room. I just pointed at the door, unable to make out any words. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was one of those cheaper ones, though, where she could use her fingernail to open it. She pushed it open, and Rai was in the corner of the room facing the wall. My mom yelled at her for locking the door, even though Rai was way too short to reach the doorknob. Rai didn't have any sort of reaction on her face. After that, I fell into a small depression, along with what seemed like the rest of the family. No one talked to each other. I became the one taking care of my baby sister. Me and the strange figure I became familiar with. It even started hanging around my bed during nights when I was extra sad, and it brought me a sort of weird comfort, knowing that I wasn't alone. Eventually, my mom had enough of my dad, and we left to stay with my grandparents. I remember her telling us to pack up, and as we headed to the car, I saw the figure again, standing right behind my dad. I felt sad leaving him, but at least he wouldn't truly be alone.
True paranormal story number 1. My cousin's Ouija board. I got a call from my cousin who said that he, his brother, his dad, and his best friend were using a Ouija board in their basement. Prior to starting, they took a large porcelain doll out of the room because it was so creepy and placed it in the adjacent room face down on a pile of towels. My cousin took a short break because the board was just spouting out nonsense. He had to go to the bathroom. His dad, brother, and friends started asking the board questions without him. One of the questions was, "Who is in the other room?" The board just started spelling out random numbers. And when my cousin came back into the room, his brother said that it wasn't working, that they're gonna put it away, and he showed him the answer to the last question he had. He said, "Dude, that's my social security number." Then they started to talk to whatever started spewing the answers out. It told my cousin he would die in the Air Force. At this point, they tell the entity that they're communicating with to prove itself. It then spelled out the word doll, and they immediately got a bad feeling. They opened the door to where the porcelain doll was in the other room, and when they opened the door, the doll was standing upright in front of the door, staring at them. Everyone freaked out and ran out of the house. My best friend burned the Ouija board, and I think he temporarily went nuts for a few months. As for my cousin, for some reason, he then joined the Air Force and is on a base in Europe now. True paranormal story number 2. I will never touch a Ouija board. I had some of my friends over one night, so we tried out the Ouija board we found in someone's garbage. It had a board and the glass piece that you hold on to. The 4 of us held on to the piece and asked stupid questions, just messing around. At times, one of us were moving around the glass piece just to try and fool the others. When one of my friends went to the bathroom and the other guy bailed out, it was just me and one of my other friends still holding on to it. I asked the board, "When will I die?" And the piece started slowly moving to the letter T. I was left looking at my friend thinking it was him, but he just told me that he thought it was me. The piece then moved to the letter O, and then M, and then back to O, and then R. And then I realized that it was spelling out the word tomorrow. My friend let go and it stopped moving, so I was convinced that it was him. But he swore left and right it wasn't him. But here's where it gets horrifying. The next day, while walking my dog to the park, my dog's leash snapped and suddenly he was free. He started running into the road, and I immediately chased after him, only to hear the horn of an oncoming car blaring and getting louder. I dove as fast as I could out of the way, just barely grazing the car with my foot as it passed by. But it didn't end there. The same day, while sitting under the ceiling fan in the kitchen on full blast, I got up to get something out of the fridge, and behind me I heard a loud crashing sound as all the glass on the table was shattered and everything fell onto the floor. The fan had fallen off the ceiling and I was inches away from being decapitated. I really don't know if it was a coincidence that the day after the Ouija board said I would die, the next day that I had 2 near-death experiences. All I know is I'm never touching a Ouija board again. The Ghost Bride. This happened in late March in India. I was 14 years old. This happened in my village. There was no cinema, so I had to travel about 12 kilometers to get to the nearest theater. We usually went to the movies in groups, but one day none of my friends wanted to go, so I headed out alone for the evening show. Afterwards, I was dropped off at a bus stop that's located at the edge of my village. It was around 11 p.m., and my village being very small, I was all alone with no one around. I started walking towards home along the main road. After walking for about 20 minutes, I saw a woman. She was dressed in white and red. I felt really scared and I knew she couldn't be human. She was covering her face with the garment, just like newlyweds do in India. So I assumed she was a new bride. I thought to myself, what's a newlywed bride doing out here, all alone, late at night? She was just standing there with only trees surrounding her. I called down to where she was and asked if she needed help, but instead of answering, she started walking into the trees, and I found myself following her all the way. But no matter how fast I walked, I was never able to catch up to her. She was always ahead of me. After a while, I regained consciousness. I looked around and discovered that I had wandered into the middle of a jungle. Suddenly, all the scary stories that my elders ever told me came back to my memory, and I stood there frozen in fear. I remember that in our culture, an evil spirit will appear dressed as a newlywed bride with no legs. Slowly, I looked down at the woman's legs and realized she didn't have any at all. I wanted to run, but the thought of her being behind me and possibly chasing me down made me feel sick and nauseous. I had chills and goosebumps all over my body. Just as all of this was coming through my mind, she stopped and turned to look at me. At that very moment, I told myself, you better run or you're gonna die right here. So I ran, and when I got close to my home, I started screaming for my mother. I then felt something grab my shoulder. It felt like a claw-like heavy hand. I screamed one last scream that I was barely able to do. My mother and brothers came outside and asked me what was wrong. I explained everything to them. They looked at my back because I said it was hurting, and there they saw claw-like scratch marks. My mother performed some rituals before letting me into the house. She wanted to ward off evil spirits so that it would never enter our home. I suffered from a very high fever for 3 days straight after seeing that evil bride. Once I was healthy again, I asked my mom if there were any new brides in our village or any surrounding village, and she said no, there was not. I still went to the movies after that, but only during the day, and never, ever alone at night again. Bloody Mary. When I was 12 years old, I became very interested in the paranormal. So my friend told me about standing in front of a mirror and reciting the words, Bloody Mary, several times in a row. Supposedly, this Bloody Mary would show up in person if you do that. I wanted to try it, but I was too afraid to do it alone. So one day, this friend and I stayed after school. After everyone had left, we walked down through the empty hall in the girls' bathroom in front of the mirror and began saying Bloody Mary 5 times in a row. We then heard a very strange female voice calling our names. We were terrified, and we ran out into the hallway, but nobody was around. 2 days later, I was sleeping in my upstairs bedroom, and I was awoken around 2 in the morning by the sound of crying. My parents were downstairs in their bedroom asleep, and there were no TVs or radios on at the time. I was terribly frightened because it sounded like a young woman crying right there next to me in my room. Then, I will never forget what happened next. I looked up and I saw a lady standing next to my bed weeping. She was very pale and had tears coming down her face. Her head was surrounded by massive unruly black hair. She wore a torn white dress. Continuing to cry, she just stared at me. I finally said, "Leave me alone." Then she disappeared, but I could not sleep again that night. The next night, I dreamt that the spirit of another woman was choking me, and the crying lady from the previous night was standing right next to her watching. I then woke up and I couldn't breathe. It felt like somebody was in the room with me. I ran out of my room in the pitch black hallway and screamed. My parents came rushing upstairs. I feel that by chanting Bloody Mary, I somehow drew these spirits to me, and it was a very, very scary experience. Although I didn't like what happened to me, I still do want to explore the paranormal. However, I'm afraid of what might happen, and my parents think I'll go to hell if I continue. The Ouija board. This story was actually from my mother when she was younger. She said one time when she was a teenager, she was curious and thinking it would be a fun experience playing with the Ouija board. Her and a group of her friends got together and started asking some questions to the Ouija board. Everything was going great until the planchette started moving on its own without anyone touching it. Slowly, it spelled out, "I will follow you forever." Everyone started screaming and panicking, and without knowing how to close the session out, they just put the board away, and that was a big mistake. As my mother was watching TV with my grandma, she heard a noise from the kitchen, and she decided to check it out. As she walked into the kitchen, a dark shadow-like entity with large, angry eyes then launched at her, causing her to scream in terror. My grandmother, who was right behind her, only saw my mom fall backwards and never saw the entity. She tried to calm her down, suggesting that she might have imagined it, and things went back to normal for a while. Later, my mom went on a trip to Laredo to buy some merchandise to sell during a bus stop. My mother went to the bathroom, and suddenly everything around her darkened, and she heard the bathroom door lock from the outside. Terrified, she started screaming and asked for help, but people who were outside couldn't open the door. She felt dozens and dozens of roaches crawling all over her feet. She began to scream louder than ever. But minutes later, the lights turned on, and someone opened the door, and everything went back to normal, just like if it was a nightmare. These strange incidences began happening more frequently, and the angry-looking entity kept bothering her, apparently unexpectedly. Eventually, my mother started dating a man who would eventually become my father. He knew a lot about these entities and also about being a Freemason. He helped my mother do a lot of these experiences and helped her overcome most of them, but sadly, he passed away in 2020. After he passed away, the paranormal experiences returned to my mom's life, knowing that her protector was now gone. Today, the entity still bothers her and appears in her nightmares and sometimes manifests materially. I, myself, will follow in my father's footsteps and will try to gain as much knowledge as I can to confront this dark entity and keep it away from my mother and from our lives forever. The Mothman. In the 1960s, in West Virginia, Point Pleasant, many paranormal and unexpected sightings occurred. All of these sightings and experiences have been documented by the authorities and the newspapers. In November of 1966, two couples went on a date to a World War II dump site in Point Pleasant. They claimed as they were there, a large winged black creature with red glowing eyes chased them out of there. They reported the incident to the police. This marked the beginning of the paranormal events ever documented. The black creature would chase people to the ground. Many times, other people would suffer from bleeding eyes. Some people saw a giant mutated owl flying in the sky. People were beginning to see this Mothman in the sky, flying over their houses, and even in their backyard. A resident claims that there was a Mothman standing by a tree about 7 foot tall, staring right at her as she was in her kitchen. She claims as she looked out the window and saw it, it had red glowing eyes. She said it then took off and flew into the sky. She swears on everything that it was not a bird or any other type of flying animal, and it was definitely not a human. Around this time when things were getting really bad, the Washington Post, which is a newspaper company, heard about all the sightings that were occurring in West Virginia, Point Pleasant. John Klein, a reporter for the Washington Post and researcher, was sent to Point Pleasant. He lost his wife 2 years earlier in a car accident. He went to Point Pleasant, and there he started his investigation. While there, he had reported on many stories. What follows is an actual documentation of his contact with the paranormal. He was in a motel room, distraught and sitting on the bed. The phone then rang, and John Klein went to pick it up. The voice on the other phone sounded electrical and cut up, but it said,
"Hello, John Klein."
"Who is this?" replied John. It said,
"My name is Andrew Gold."
Before John could say anything else, it said,
"Your father was born and raised in Wisconsin. You lived in a greenhouse on Monroe Street, and you don't remember how your mother looked."
John knew this was not a hoax, so he said, "Okay, you have my attention." He then placed his watch in his shoe and placed his shoe under the bed. He asked the voice on the phone, "Where's my watch?" The voice said on the phone,
"Your watch is in your shoe, under the bed."
John then got up and closed the curtains to his motel room and turned off the lights, hoping that no one was looking in. He then sat back down on the bed, picked up chapstick, and put it in his hand. He picked up the phone and asked, "What is in my hand?" Slowly, an electrical voice said,
"Chapstick."
At that point, John Klein became even more fearful of who he was speaking with. He got on the ground and pulled a book from the nightstand and quickly asked the entity on the phone, "Read me line 3, page 55. The entity said it word for word. John sat up for a few seconds and asked the entity, "What do you look like?" The entity replied,
"Why, it all depends on who's looking."
His next question was, "Can I please meet you?" The entity again quickly answered back and replied,
"You already have, John. You already have."
The last question and the most important question in this conversation that John asked was, "What happened to my wife?" The entity then said,
"You saw what happened to her. You were there. You cannot find her by looking. You will see her in due time."
The phone then flew off of John's ear through electrical static, and that was the end of the conversation with the entity. John Klein had an actual conversation with the Mothman. After the collapse of the bridge in West Virginia, Point Pleasant, in 1967, the sightings and the paranormal activity calmed down greatly to the point to where there was very little activity that was documented. True, scary, paranormal story number 1. We invited something evil. This story happened to me when I was still a teenager. I had a wonderful boyfriend at the time. He had experienced numerous paranormal encounters, yet for some odd reason he insisted on trying to explain everything with reason and logic. According to him, there was no spirits, demons, or even God. It was very annoying because his whole life was full of paranormal experiences. Yet somehow he chose not to believe in the paranormal. He would argue endlessly to prove he was right. One day, we were in his room and we had gotten into a discussion about the paranormal. I decided to tell him an old story I had heard, a story that had no loopholes for him to use against me. I will not narrate the story, mainly because the horror we experienced that day seems to be linked to the story. The most I would say is that it is a story about an ancient evil spirit which attacked several different people, and a lot of other pieces of evidence were presented in the story. I thought the fact that there were several witnesses to these events, my boyfriend could not argue against it. However, he still argued, and while we were arguing, I noticed there was a slight change in the atmosphere. The change was subtle, but I'm quite sensitive, so I noticed. I just ignored the feeling and kept arguing with my boyfriend, but the feeling intensified. It was like an evil pressure that kept increasing at some point. It felt like we were not alone in the room anymore. At that point, I was having difficulty following the argument because I couldn't coherently arrange my ideas. Then suddenly, my boyfriend stopped talking. His face became really pale, and he said in a really frightened voice, "Do you feel that?" I said yes. We decided to leave the room and go outside for some fresh air, hoping to escape the evil atmosphere. My two sisters were downstairs. We walked past them, telling them we were going for a walk, but they kept looking at us bizarrely, and oddly enough, they seemed distant. Like they were not really there, like they were on another side, like a mirror. My boyfriend and I went outside, but that evil atmosphere followed us. I was really worried, not just about the evil atmosphere that was following us, but also because we seemed detached from our surroundings. The trees, houses, people, the street, and even the cars driving by. Everything seemed like it was in a different dimension. I turned to ask my boyfriend if he was experiencing the same thing too, but noticed he couldn't hear me. I called out to him, but he did not respond. So I reached out my hand to touch him, just so I can get his attention. But he started running so fast and so scared, like something was chasing him. I tried to call out to him, but no matter how much I shouted, he couldn't hear me, and it seemed none of the passerbyers could hear me either, although some of them kept looking at me bizarrely. To my horror, my boyfriend ran into the street and was knocked down by a car. I screamed and shouted and ran to him. He was unconscious. Other passerbyers also gathered, and together we called emergency services. He was rushed to the hospital, and thankfully he recovered. He later told me that he started running because he could see a dark, very scary entity chasing him, and all that he could see around him was darkness. Also, I later realized that when the car ran him over, I rushed to him, and that's when I felt the evil atmosphere disappear. And that feeling of being cut off from this reality was also gone. It's been many years since we had that experience, and we are no longer together, but we're still close friends, and every once in a while we talk about those events. What we've concluded, based on our understanding of those events, is that while arguing about the paranormal story, I told my then boyfriend we somehow invited an evil spirit, probably the evil spirit of the story, and that was possible maybe because of how much emotion we were putting into the argument. Please beware of the supernatural. It's real. He now believes, but as for me, I always have. The Goat Girl. While I was driving down the highway one night, headed home from working late at my job, I came across a young woman standing on the side of the road. I pulled up to her and asked her if she needed a ride, and she then nodded her head up and down and smiled at me. I opened my truck door and she hopped in. As we began driving down the road, I asked her where she was headed, and she told me to just go to the nearest town, which was about 20 minutes away. This girl looked young, maybe around 18 years old, and she did not talk the whole time. I decided to play some music, so I put my tape in the cassette player. After about 3 minutes of listening to music, I reached over to turn off the cassette player, but I accidentally hit the eject button, and the cassette tape fell onto the ground of the truck. She looked down at the cassette on the ground, and so did I, but I was driving at the same time. So, as I held on to the wheel with one hand, my other hand reached down to the ground to pick up the cassette. I was looking at the road, and every once in a while I had to look back down to the floor to grab the tape. The cassette tape was right next to her feet. As I looked at her feet, I was shocked to the core. What I saw to this day has petrified me. What I'm about to tell you is something that only the brave can handle. This girl had goat legs and goat feet. Her legs had fur and her feet were hooves. I was in shock and my eyes opened wide and I could feel my face go numb. I quickly looked at her and she was staring right at me. She knew that I saw her legs. I sat back up really quickly and through the corner of my eye I could see she was still staring at me. I couldn't stop shaking. She then started laughing. I can hear her laughing and giggling, yet through the corner of my eye, her mouth wasn't even moving. I slammed on the brakes and reached over quickly, grabbed the handle to the truck, and I opened the truck door. I lifted up my leg and I kicked her out. She flew out of the truck. I then slammed on the gas and took off. I was driving the truck well over 100 miles an hour down the highway. I looked over to my left out of the window, and her face was looking right at me. She was flying and gliding right next to my truck window. How was this even possible, I thought. She was cursing and yelling. I could hear her screaming through the window. I drove even faster, and I don't know how fast I was going, but it must have been fast because she vanished. I made it to the nearest town. I got off, had to get my composure together. I was traumatized, and to this very day, I still am. When I was about 6 years old, we lived in a trailer in Rosenberg, Texas, and my mother would watch over me and my little sister while my dad went to work. One morning, my mom was making eggs in the kitchen while me and my sister were in my mom's room. My sister was asleep on my mom's bed while I was coloring in a coloring book. I was facing the wall standing up, and my sister was on the bed right behind me. I just remember feeling as if something was behind me, and I heard a small noise. So I turned around and I was shocked to the core and caught by surprise. There was a blue-looking girl around 12 or so staring right at me. She was slowly folding a blanket, looking right into my eyes. She had black, long hair, and it looked wet. Also, it looked as if she was wearing a nightgown. This ghost-looking girl was inches away from my little sister who was asleep on the bed. I smiled and I said hi to her out of fear and waved at her. I slowly turned back around towards my coloring book, and deep inside I was petrified. I started coloring again, yet my mind was set on running out of that room. I was so afraid of this girl catching me while I was trying to run away. Yet, I counted down from 5. As soon as I got to 1, I took off out of the room screaming. My mother was in the kitchen and she turned towards me, wondering what happened. I explained everything to my mother. At first, she didn't believe me, but she eventually decided to go look in the room. She went into the room where I saw the girl, and nothing was there. Just my little sister sleeping on the bed. My mother told me to stay out of the room. After about 10 minutes, I then slowly walked up to the doorway and peeked into the room, and nothing was there. I then walked in and looked around the room, and to my shock and surprise, there was a wet spot right where the girl was standing. I looked towards my little sister, and there was a blanket on top of her. It was the same blanket that the ghost girl was folding. The Walking Cheetah. I'm a mechanic, and in the 1960s I was about 19 years old, and I had just gotten done working late on some cars at the shop. I was really tired, and it was about 9 o'clock p.m. or so, and I can remember saying goodbye to the owner of the shop and making my way back home on the road. This location was in the Bridgewater Triangle area, which is known to be a very paranormal hotspot. I don't live in it, but I did have to drive through it every day to and from work. I remember that day that I was truly tired and I just wanted to make it home. I was driving down the highway and it was surrounded by woods on both sides. I was about 10 minutes away from home. As I was driving, I noticed that my light above my head started flickering. I really didn't pay much attention to it. I kept driving, but a couple of minutes later, my car started shaking. Then it completely stalled out. I was surprised because I've always kept up with my vehicle, especially working on cars as a career. I pulled over to the side of the road. I got out of my car with a flashlight and I made my way over to the hood of the car and I opened it. I couldn't find anything wrong with it. The engine was in great condition. I heard a noise coming from the right side of me in the woods near the side of the road. It sounded like a couple of branches breaking. I then shined my flashlight towards that direction, but I didn't see anything. I felt really vulnerable being out there alone in the pitch black. I then leaned over under the hood, shining my flashlight at the engine, trying to figure any reason of why my car would stall out. Just then, something pushed me to the ground on my back, and my flashlight rolled away from me, and I couldn't see anything. I just felt something on top of me. Whatever was on me was scratching me, and was also punching me over and over again. At the same time, it was cursing at me. I remember screaming for my dear life. I reached over and I was able to grab my flashlight and started hitting the creature that was on me with the flashlight. That's when I finally got a good look at it, with the flashlight shining every so often on its face. What I saw petrifies me to this day. It was a creature with a cheetah-like face, but it had small horns and its eyes were glowing red, and it was covered in black fur, and it had claws that were covered in blood. I continued screaming and hitting the creature with the flashlight, but it didn't do anything to the creature. Just when I felt like there was no hope and I was going to die, I saw headlights coming down the highway, and it shined right on me and the creature as we were laying in the middle of the road. The creature then turned towards the lights coming down the road and jumped off of me and ran straight into the woods. I turned towards the car that was parked in the middle of the road with its lights still shining on my face, and a man slowly came out of the car and walked towards me. He asked me if I was okay. I told him, did he see what was on the road that was attacking me? He said yes, that I was actually attacked by a large wolf. He said that when it ran back in the woods, it was running on its back hind legs like a human. At that point, I was petrified. I knew that what attacked me was no human or no animal. The man then gave me a ride to the police station, where I filed the report, and later on that night they searched the area, but found nothing. I'm now 64 years old, and I will never ever second guess my story. It really did happen to me, and I'll never forget it.
Scary true story number 2. The Imaginary Kid.
When I was about 11 years old, my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot from place to place, and I hardly ever had the chance to make friends. We moved into a neighborhood that didn't have many kids. I would ride my bike around the block and basically would try to find something to do. One day, I was riding my bike, and there was a kid standing on the sidewalk. He looked nice, and he smiled and introduced himself as Jack. We made friends pretty quick. He pointed to the house behind him and told me that's where he lived. It looked pretty big, but it had a scary look to it, kind of like a Victorian house. The neighborhood that we were in had pretty old houses in it, but we had a pretty good house too, with my dad being in the military. My house was in a cul-de-sac area down the road from Jack's house, about 11 houses down. I started going over to his house, but he would never let me in his house. We would always play outside. After about 2 weeks, I noticed that he would never hold anything in his hands. He would always use his hands as guns. He would always hide behind trees and would act like Indians and cowboys. There were many times that I brought my toys over, and he'd be excited about it. But again, he would never pick them up. It came to a point to where I really didn't care about that. I was just happy that I had made a friend. But everything came crashing down one night. I was extremely thirsty, and I wanted a glass of water. I then asked him, is there any way he can give me something to drink from his house? And he said, I can't go inside because my parents don't want me to come inside at this time. I got really upset and told him if I could please talk to his mom myself, that I wanted a glass of water. I was pretty tired because we had played for about 3 hours. I kept asking him, but he really got upset and he told me, no, I can't. I just can't. I just remember getting really upset at him and getting on my bike and riding back to my house. And I stopped playing with him for about a week. But one day I got really bored and I got on my bike and I decided to go around the block. I saw him outside in front of his house, smiling, just like the first time I saw him. He waved me down and told me that he was really sorry for getting upset at me. I told him that it was my fault and that I was sorry. We made up. He said that there was something he wants to show me really important. I was pretty surprised, and I followed him to his backyard where he told me to follow him. And there was an axe stuck in the dirt. He pointed to it and said, look what I found. It was a really old axe. He told me to pick it up, and so I picked it up. Then he brought me to a log that was on the ground nearby. He called it a special log, and he said for me to hit it with the axe. But I told him, no, you do it. Then he got upset and told me to just hit the log with the axe. I again told him, no, why don't you do it? And he said, I just can't pick it up. So I decided to just pick up the axe and slam it down on the log. So I raised the axe in the air and I counted down from 3, 2, 1, and I hit the log that was on the ground as hard as I could. But just then, a piece of the wood from the log went into the air and went directly into my right eye. I screamed and I dropped the axe and ran towards my bike. He started laughing really loud and chased me to my bike, laughing at me. I finally knew that it was a setup, a plan to get me back for leaving him that day. I got on my bike and I started riding down the road towards my house. But the scary thing is that the whole time I was riding my bike, he was right behind me laughing, behind my ear, inches away from me. He laughed all the way down the road to my house. I turned back and he wasn't even there. It was just his voice. Blood was pouring down my right eye, and my mother rushed me to the hospital, where they had to do multiple operations to try to fix my eye. But to this day, I am still blind from my right eye. I began to realize as the days went by that it all added up, that the kid was actually a ghost. I finally realized that I was playing all those weeks with the ghost or an entity. You see, he wore the same clothes every day and never changed them. I also realized that he never grabbed or picked up anything off the ground. He never played with my toys, and he would never let me into his house or to see his parents. And on top of it all, there was no cars ever parked outside. To this day, it gives me the chills just thinking about it.
Scary true story number 3. The entity under the car. In 1990, me and my family went on a vacation to visit family in Mexico. We went shopping and spent some time with our family. It was a total of about 4 days that we were over there, and we were headed back home. We filled our tank and started our drive, but not long after filling up our tank, we then got a flat tire. We had a spare in the back, so after fixing the tire, we continued on our way back home. About an hour later, while still in Mexico, the other tire went flat. We pulled over into a tire shop that was connected to a store. My father tried turning the car back on, but it didn't want to start. My dad had a weird feeling about everything. Me and my dad got off to speak with the mechanics at the shop, but on the way up there, we noticed an old man sitting down on a bench outside the shop. The old man asked my dad what was the problem, and my dad told him that we had 2 flats, and now our car doesn't want to start. The old man said something that made my skin crawl. My dad's jaw dropped, and the hair on my arms went straight up. What the old man told us gave me nightmares to this day. He said there's a demon under your car, hanging upside down, watching us talking right now. It's looking right at you and me. My father then turned and looked under the car, and we could see a black figure hovering under the car. The old man said that the black shadow entity was following us because we brought something from Mexico that we shouldn't have. Just then, my dad remembered that he bought a hat on the side of the road from someone right before all these bad things happened. It was like a black cowboy hat. We took it to the old man and showed him the hat. The old man said someone died in that hat. My father then threw the black hat in the trash can. We got back in the car and immediately started without any problems. We then got our tire fixed and made it back home safely. I always think of this as a lesson to always pay very close attention to all the things you purchase, especially on vacation. Thank you for listening to Master of Horror, where I give you the scariest stories I've ever came by. Please check out my other videos that are guaranteed to petrify you. If you enjoyed these stories, please like and subscribe for more. Okay, my friends, until next time, have a great night. And don't forget to leave the nightlight on.
This is 100% true, so this will probably be a boring account compared to some of the other posts here. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My mom would often take us camping in the summer. This particular camping trip was somewhere in the vicinity near a reservation in the New Mexico area. My mother took my older brother Chris, who was 10, and myself, 8, camping, often in those days, and preferred dispersed camping on NPS land rather than camping on merged grounds. She usually would find us a spot and make herself busy setting up the tents, while Chris and I would run around and explore the area and be generally unhelpful. On this particular trip, we arrived in the middle of the day, and as my mom started setting up camp, Chris and I started to explore the area around our campsite. We wandered into the woods of our campsite. Being in the desert, it was really just stunted trees and bushes. So I hesitate to describe it as a forest, but the trees and the brush were taller than me. I wandered down deeper and came face to face with what I described to my mother as a wolfman. It was crouched low with long slender arms reaching down to the ground and large pointed ears like a deer. The fur covering its body was sandy brown and patchy, as if it had mange. It had large orange eyes and a snout like a wolf or a coyote. It showed its teeth at me and stood up in its full height. It was the biggest animal I'd ever seen, towering well above both of us. I had never been, and probably still have never been, as frightened as I was that day. Then Chris and I started screaming for our mom to come to our rescue. Chris regained his senses before me, taking off running back up the embankment to the campsite. The wolfman turned and sort of sped off as he scanned the area, and he went through the brushes and trees. Its legs were backwards like a dog's, and its strides took it far away faster than any deer or antelope I'd ever seen. After a split second of staring at it in horror, I followed my brother up the embankment, screaming for my mom. We were so frightened that my mom packed us back into the car and moved campsites. We went to a managed campsite. Chris and I were too scared to sleep in our own tent that night, and we clung to my mom, listening to the smallest twig snapping in the brush. So that's my story. It's boring compared to some of the others here, but it's 100% true, and I wanted to share it. I vividly remember the way this animal moved as it ran away from us into the brush, and the sheer utter horror I felt looking into its face. Chris and I have never managed to find an explanation for what we saw that night in the brush.
Scary, true, paranormal story number 2.
I used to work at a local coal mining company on the Navajo reservation as an operator for a coal mining crew. I drove equipment, and it was hauling one of those 40-ton coal dump trucks. If you ever seen those trucks, they're pretty huge. They're about 2 to 3 stories high. I remember that I was working the night shift, which started around 12 midnight. Before we started this shift, we were required to do a pre-start inspection of our equipment. I walked around my truck, and when I went up to the rear of the truck and lowered its stairs that gave me access to the engine bay, I walked up the stairs and started my inspection. I found a bad leak in the engine. I climbed back down and went to the cab and called my supervisor. He answered and asked me if I can drive the truck to the main shop for repairs. So I drove 6 to 8 miles back to the shop, and I called the maintenance supervisor, and he instructed me to drive around the back of the shop and park the truck there. I drove around to the back and parked the truck. I called my supervisor over the radio and asked him to pick me up. As I started to walk away from the truck towards the shop, that's when I finally seen it. It was huge. It walked weird and had patches of tan fur missing and blotches of blackened skin. And its head was big. The head was as large as a pumpkin, and it wobbled around like it was unbalanced. It had an unnatural look, nothing like I'd ever seen before. This thing walked on all fours and was about 4 to 5 feet tall. It was about 100 feet away and was walking toward me. My first instinct was that it was a sick dog that was mange infested and malnourished. It continued to walk toward me, and I thought this sucker might be sick and had rabies. I took out my flashlight and shined the light at it, yelling at it to stay away. Yet it continued to walk towards me. It was then that I noticed it wasn't alive. Its eyes did not give off any reflection and were black and solid. It was unnatural. I reached for my pocket knife and yelled at it to stop. It stopped when it was about 20 feet away. It was still walking towards the shop, and it followed me all the way there. I never looked away. I thought it could attack me. By the time I got to the shop door entrance, it started walking towards the side. I went inside and got the shop supervisor, and we both came outside. It wasn't until about a minute later, and it was gone. We walked to the east of the shop, and my supervisor drove up. Now, there was only one way into the back side of the shop, and my supervisor should have seen it, but he didn't. I explained to him what I saw, and he said he didn't see it on the way into the shop. My supervisor said that I saw a skinwalker, and that it usually was seen walking around the shop. The rest of the shift I stayed with my supervisor. I think he was scared. I wasn't scared, nor did I get into shock, like some people describe. It was an experience that I would never forget.
Scary true story number 3.
This just happened to me not too long ago. I'm a 21-year-old female, pretty but not a model. I'm normal size living in Oklahoma. I have a job and have never had anything that could be considered mental episode. I live in Tulsa, the second largest city in the state. To give a little backstory, I live in a house with 4 roommates, all men. I think of them as my brothers, and we never really worry about anything like intruders and always have our 3 back doors unlocked. Now, to give you a visual aid, I live in the front part of the house, the living area, and 2 of the doors are back doors to my roommates' rooms. The backyard is large, though it's a pretty urban area. It snowed a few days ago, and there's still some snow on the ground, and it's freezing, but there's no smoking in the house. I put up my jacket and threw on some slippers. I tell my roommates that I'm going to go outside to smoke alone. Anyways, I usually bring my phone, but this time I didn't. I've been bringing people because I've been hearing strange noises. I'm not the only one that heard them either. My other roommates have heard them too. Sounds that resonate in our backyard. They sort of sound like twigs breaking. The fence surrounding our yard is wood until about halfway up, and then the chain link starts. So it's about 2 a.m. and I'm on the porch smoking when something catches my eye. Now, I have 2 cats in my house, my boy cat and my roommate's female cat. There's a cat that wanders around and tries to sneak in from time to time, and I noticed this thing that caught my eyes close to the ground. I assume it's the cat and start looking around for something to shoo it away with. Finding nothing, I resort to building a snowball and I throw it. A small one, nothing too big. I didn't want to hurt it. I just wanted for it to go away. So I throw the snowball and it hits it. That's when I realized how big this thing was. As soon as the ball hit it, my entire body filled with fear, one that I cannot explain. I was frozen. I watched this thing slowly stand up. It looked like a man, but taller, and its knees were bent in the wrong way. It was unbelievably tall. Its arms were twice as long, its face was distorted, and it had horns like a goat with red glowing eyes. It looked at me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. With non-human speed, it took off towards the back of my yard, and it was gone. I was able to move again, and I crashed through the doors into my house. I screamed for my roommates to lock the doors and tried to calm my trembling down. They kept telling me that I'm tripping and that it can't be real, but I'm not on any drugs and I know what I saw. I forced my roommate to go outside with me, and there are prints in the snow. While I can't confirm that they are the creatures, they appear too large. While I can't confirm they are the creatures, they appear too large to be any of mine or my roommates. My cats won't go anywhere near any of the doors. That night, there was this very strange tapping and scratching coming from the attic. I couldn't get more than 45 minutes of sleep that night.
The Lurking Skinwalker.
So this took place in my dad's then girlfriend's house during broad daylight in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Just off of River Road, behind the house, there was a forest, but it's a bit dense to play in, so we usually just followed the deer trail into the woods. There was a clearing where there was a barbed wire fence that went right through the middle of it. We'd just jump over the fence and go through the woods on the other side. My brother and I were back there with the girlfriend's nephew, just fooling around, being rowdy and noisy. There is a road, which is actually a trail, but we just called it the road. And on the other side of the road was a more dense forest. We reached the road and stopped and talked like we usually did to look at the deer tracks and the squirrel tracks. That's when we smelled something skunky. My brother and I both felt an urge to look up the road towards the fence. That's when we saw what looked like a head of a huge black wolf, but it didn't look right. Its ears weren't in the right spots and looked droopy. Its eyes looked off. They were too big and bright for its face. Its front legs were long and skinny. It was standing on its back hind legs. My brother and I looked at each other. And here's where I'm going to mention that my brother and I are very close. We knew that we had to leave right when we looked at each other. We walked slowly to the back entrance. We looked back and there it was, looking straight at us through the bush. We didn't hear it move behind us or anything. We pointed it out to the nephew and we all watched it flop back into the woods. Now my brother and I have been raised in the country. We've seen wolves, bears, moose, and everything else. We both have never seen a wolf that big and lanky in our lives. I feel like it's important to note that at least I didn't feel any dread or anything like that. It was more straightforward fear. Like I knew we all had to get out of there. I felt like if we ran from it, it would have taken us down. My brother and I told my dad, and he didn't seem too interested, but he was that way anyways. Growing up, we've always had to deal with that. The next morning, my brother and I went back out to look for the tracks so we could see where it stopped us. We saw huge dog-like tracks, and about 6 feet up in a tree following its route back was some thick black fur. We ran out of there fast and didn't go back without protection. About a few weeks later, I'm home alone. All the doors are locked, and only the back window in the house is open. I suddenly noticed the dogs are acting weird. That I hear clear as day by the back door my dad's girlfriend's voice call out for her dog. I froze, but looked up at my bedroom doorway into the small hall. The dog got up and went to the kitchen where the back door was. She was quiet for a moment. Then I heard her claws skid right across the floor as if something grabbed her. The dog then ran back into my room. I got off the bed, hurried up and closed the door, and locked it fast and closed my window. The only reason it freaked me out was because I didn't hear the garage door open or the side door open, just the voice. I blessed my room by myself and made sure nothing was allowed in or around it. The next time my brother visited, he slept in the living room. Now the living room was huge and you could see out to the front deck. As my brother was sleeping around 2:30 in the morning, he heard what he described as an old woman crying on the deck. He woke up, panicking, and said he turned on the porch light and there was a big black crow sitting on the deck staring right at him. After that, he only slept in my room, never out in the open. Just to let you know that neither of us knew what a skinwalker was at the time, being that we were 11 and 13, that it was a goofy wolf that smelled bad. Later, we found out what a skinwalker was, and that's most likely what we encountered that day. Scary, true paranormal story number 2. So I grew up in Utah and lived about an hour away from the Skinwalker Ranch. Going there as a high schooler was just a thing to do, just to see if it was true or not, to see if you could actually see something supernatural. First time for me was all it took. Me and a couple of friends went out there and got pretty far in. We got out of the car and started walking around. Mind you, this was around 2:30 in the morning. We found an old beat-up woodshed. It looked like it was falling apart, and you could see right through the holes of it. There were hooks, the kind used for hanging up deer and cows in it. It looked mostly rusted, but the walls and everything around looked like it was splattered with old dry blood. It was everywhere. The worst part started happening when we walked away from the shed. Since we had a couple of flashlights, we were able to look around when we were walking. We would see pairs of eyes around us. At first it was just the shiny reflection that kind of looked like when you shined a light into a cat's eyes. So we thought it was just a couple of dogs or coyotes and continued a bit more. Then we started seeing more eyes, but they were red, bright red. We noticed that they were a lot higher than a normal level would be for an animal. That's when we decided to turn back. What started to terrify me was one pair was out in front of us as we were walking to the car, staring at us like it was walking backwards with us. We never caught up to it, but it never left. Same with all the others that kept circling us as we made our way back to the car. When we got to the car, we just wanted to get out of there. We got in and it wouldn't start. Nothing would turn on at first, no matter how hard he turned the key. He tried it twice and only the radio kicked on. We started panicking. We were petrified because the eyes got closer and closer, and then bam, that's when something hit the side of the car really hard, but we couldn't see what it was. It hit the car and the right side 3 times. My buddy got the car started. Finally, after like 5 minutes of freaking out trying to get it going, I'm in the passenger seat about to crap myself. My other friend was in the back seat, freaked out but speechless, with the most scared look I've ever seen on his face. But when he got the car started, there was no delay in leaving. He put the car in gear and took off and got us out of there. Once you get out of the gate onto the main road, you're pretty much off the ranch. We thought we were away from everything since we were on an actual road, but my buddy didn't slow down. We were going 90 miles an hour down that road, going straight home. I looked toward the left, and about 15 feet off was a pair of red eyes. It was keeping up with us, and that's when it charged at us. I kind of got a glimpse before it smashed into the side of the car. It was big, like 4 feet from the ground. It was black and had those glowing red eyes. I turned away from it and closed my eyes. Everyone was screaming. We eventually lost it, and when we got home, we went straight to bed. In the morning, we looked at my friend's car. It had a huge dent on the left rear fender and another dent on the right door of the passenger side, about the size of my head. We were so lucky to get out of there.
Scary True Paranormal Story number 3.
So every summer I go to a lake in upstate York near the Canadian border. My family has a house that is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's about an hour drive to the nearest convenience store. We have 3 neighbors on our side of the lake, but there aren't any kids, and it's mostly older retired or vacationing elderly people. They don't stay up past 9, and it's perfectly quiet when the sun goes down. So here's my story. I have zero explanation for this, and the most reasonable thing to assume is a skinwalker. Around midnight, my cousin and I go down to the dock on the water. We have to walk through a short path in the woods to get there, and the thick trees border directly on the shore. While looking out at the stars in the water, we hear a quiet, low rumbling sound. That's the best way to describe it. It came from the forest, pretty far away. We didn't really know what it was and wasn't bothered by it. About 10 minutes later, we hear the same voice say both our names. This time it was closer to our property. From our dock, we can see along the shoreline, and we're near a corner, so we can see pretty well along the coast to our left. We looked with a flashlight in the trees and saw nothing. Maybe someone was kayaking at night and said something to their friend, and we just heard them wrong. Sounds travel across water, so it couldn't have been someone from their house, although our neighbors are about 1/3 of a mile away. Our uncle couldn't have been pulling a prank on us because of how far it was, and there wasn't any light at all. 10 minutes passed and we've calmed down. While we were sitting there in silence talking about what just happened, we hear footsteps, loud leaf crunching footsteps about 10 feet to the left of our dock, right behind the tree line. We couldn't see anything. These footsteps were either from a human or a bear or a deer. My cousin whispered to me that we need to get inside, but I told him that it might be a bear. I didn't want to get chased while running back to the house. So we were sitting on the dock holding our breath as the footsteps continued to get closer to us. Then it stopped. All of a sudden we hear the same voice that said our names earlier say, "Hello." I've never been more terrified in my life. The voice was speaking English, but it wasn't human. It had an almost robotic growl under the word. Both of us flipped out at this point and sprinted to the house, not even trying to glance at what it was in the trees. My uncle was sitting on the couch with our dog. We spent the next 30 minutes checking the whole property and the nearby forest and didn't see anything. I continued to ask, what the hell was it? This happened a little more than 2 weeks ago. And the scariest part I wondered is, how did that thing know our names and why was it on our property? Yesterday, I was reminded of a skinwalker from some YouTube videos. It fits perfectly with the story, but they aren't known for being in New York. I wish I saw what it was to see if it had a human or a deer form, but the trees were so thick and it was so dark we couldn't see anything behind the trees. Anyways, that's my story. You don't have to believe it, but it happened.
The Garage Entity.
This took place about 10 years ago with me and my friends on the night of my 14th birthday party sleepover, but I still can't forget it. So my parents had a garage on our property that they had partly renovated. It had walls and bathroom, but still had the garage door that rolled up, which wasn't completely sealed. There weren't many curtains on the windows. Our property wasn't totally isolated, but the nearest neighbor was nearly 4 miles away. We never had any problems on our street, and it was the kind of place that you didn't need to lock your doors. So the day of my birthday party comes, but up until this point, my parents had to let my older brother stay in the garage, and I wasn't allowed to have any friends sleep there overnight. I begged my parents to let us have the sleepover in the garage, even though my mom was unsure, but my dad agreed since it was my birthday. After a long day filled with sugar and driving my parents crazy, we finally got ready for the sleepover in the garage. But we had strict instructions to go to bed and turn off the lights by 11 o'clock p.m. And it was my responsibility to make sure the garage door was locked from the inside. I made sure to lock the door and settled in for the night. At 11 o'clock p.m. we turned off the lights but couldn't sleep. So that's when we decided to play hide and seek with the lights off, like teenagers do. We were about 3 rounds in, and my best friend was the one looking for us. I was hiding behind a dresser next to the garage door, but when the first person got caught, I heard giggling coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was an echo because there was no way someone could have found a hiding place behind me with me up against the wall in the garage door. The second person was caught, and there was more giggling from behind me. Now I was freaking out, but I didn't want to ruin the game, so I quietly moved to a different spot facing one of the windows. It was pretty dark outside, but the moon was bright enough to see shadows inside the garage. It was completely dark, and I was trying not to get caught when I saw a shadow pass by the window and stop. Now, I was sure someone was outside, but I thought it might be my dad or my older brother checking if we were in bed, so I froze. My best friend ran straight into me and started laughing. I quickly shushed her and said, "My dad's outside. We need to go back into bed." So we quietly grabbed the other girls and quietly got back into our beds, thinking we had avoided getting into trouble. When we didn't hear my dad saying anything, I turned over in my bed, but the shadow was still there. It looked as if it was in the garage. By this time, I was really freaking out. The shadow moved away, then there was scratching on the garage door. It was coming from inside the garage. This time the other girls noticed. We all started quietly panicking and got into my bed, hoping whatever it was would just go away, or that we were just imagining things because of all the sweets that we ate that night. We were freaking out but didn't scream. I had just gotten a phone for my birthday, but it was still in the house with the other presents. With no way to quietly call my parents, we asked whatever it was to please go away. Then we heard something crawling on the ground around us. There is no carpet in the garage, just concrete, so it was very noticeable that something was crawling on the ground. It was a scraping noise, like it had claws or nails. We all heard this. I covered my face with the blanket, and so did my friends. We then decided on the count of 3 to get up and run out of the garage into the house. As soon as we got up, we rushed out of the garage and yelled for my dad. My dad and older brother went into the garage and saw that nothing was there. We slept in my parents' room that night. It was another 3 years until I finally slept in that garage alone.
Scary, true paranormal story number 2.
So, about 15 years ago, I was living with my ex-girlfriend and her sister. The house was not far from town. Within the first few weeks of living there, strange things were happening regularly. Lights going out randomly and noises upstairs as if somebody was walking around and sometimes even running. Things got pretty severe as time went on. One week in particular was the most terrifying. The first thing that happened that week was on a Tuesday night. Everyone was working and I was home alone watching television, and our cat was acting really weird, backing into a corner, and its back was arched up like it was scared. When I went to get up and see why my cat was doing this, the electricity went out in the house and it was pitch black inside. The second thing that happened is I heard really loud footsteps running down the stairs towards me. I got up and braced myself for whatever it was, but there was nothing. I mustered up the courage and went outside to the front garden to check if other houses' lights were out, but my house was the only one that was dark. I went to the fuse box and reset the trip switch, and all was back to normal. A few days later, I think on a Thursday, we were all in the living room watching a movie, eating pizza. The lights were on, and it was a good atmosphere in the house. Then, out of nowhere, a massive bang was heard upstairs, as if something huge fell to the ground. We got up to check it out, and I went into our bedroom and saw my bedside table in the middle of the room. The worst and last thing that happened to me was on a Saturday night, and I'll never forget this, and it still gives me the chills when I think about it. We go to bed. Everything is normal. I watch a bit of a movie and fall asleep. I wake up facing the wall and glance at the alarm clock. It reads 3:33 a.m. I turn over to go back to sleep and see my ex standing in the middle of the room, Confused, I begin to sit up and ask her what's going on. But as I start to sit up, I realized my ex is asleep in the bed next to me. So fear then runs through me, and I'm frozen on the spot. My eyes adjust, and I barely make out the figure of a young girl in a nightdress. She's soaking wet with her head looking down at the floor. I can hear the water drops on the carpet, and I'm just sitting there completely shocked. I couldn't believe it. After a couple of seconds, it melts away. It fades out of sight. I got up and turned the lights on and tried to tell myself that it was just a nightmare. But the problem was, there was a wet patch of water exactly where she was standing. We moved out shortly after that, and I can still picture her to this day, though it's the creepiest thing I've ever experienced.
True, scary, paranormal story number 3.
I believe this was in July or August of 2018. My husband and 3 daughters and I were at the beach having a get-together with some of my extended family who lived in the area. It was a really nice time and good to connect with everyone, but after a couple of hours, my second oldest, age 13 at the time, came up to me and asked if I could take her home. I could tell by her expression and tone that she was pretty tired. I myself was also getting really tired. So I found my husband and let him know that I was going to take her home and to let our other girls know. She and I got in the car. My husband brought his own car to the beach, so they were going to come home later. It was only once we parked up onto the porch and I jiggled the handle to the door when we realized it was locked and we didn't have a key. My husband had the main key, so I told my daughter to go around the back to try and climb through the huge window above the kitchen sink. While she was making her way around the house, I tried calling my husband just in case she couldn't get in, but he didn't pick up the phone. I was in the middle of trying to call my husband a second time when I looked through the window next to the front door, which allows you to see through to the kitchen and the back door, and saw my daughter standing in the kitchen doorway. It was dark, but I could see her standing there looking down at the kitchen table. I know my daughter, she's quite short like me and has a very petite figure like my mom, so I could recognize her from miles away. "Great job," I remember calling out. "Come on now, unlock the door." She raised her head and turned it towards me and looked right at me. I called out again, "Come, unlock the door," but she didn't move. By the way she was standing, I could tell that she was staring right at me, but she didn't move a muscle. At first I thought maybe she was on her phone or something, but I could clearly see her arms on either side of her. She was standing in a very weird position as well. Her feet were a good distance apart, and her arms were slightly raised from her sides. I didn't feel uneasy yet, but I was very confused. We continued to stare at each other for several more seconds. Lily, I remember saying her name again. No more than 5 seconds after that, my daughter came jogging out from the side of the house and up the steps telling me she couldn't get inside the house because there was a screen on the window. I stared at my daughter for a moment with what must have been a very terrified expression because her face instantly looked concerned. She asked me if everything was okay. I couldn't answer, and I remember feeling my whole body starting to shake. I looked back through the window, and this thing was now in the living room, still standing in that weird position and staring right at me. Fear and adrenaline shot through my veins in a way only a mother can know, and I practically yanked my daughter from those steps and ran to the neighbor's house to get a spare key. Whatever was in my house was gone by the time we returned, or at least out of sight from the window. However, I did not let my daughter leave the neighbor's house until I inspected every inch to make sure that there was no intruder. The human brain automatically tries to give everything a logical explanation. So the more I thought about it, the more I was feeling like it had been imagined. But I eventually chopped it up to being exhausted or whatever, because honestly, what else could it have been? I didn't tell my daughter about my experience. I didn't want to scare her. To this day, when I think about what I saw that night, it still torments me. Thank you, my friends, for listening to Master of Horror. If you liked what you've heard, please like and subscribe for more true, scary, paranormal stories with thunderstorm sounds. Okay, my friends, till next time, sleep tight, and don't forget to leave the nightlight on.
The Hooded Figure.
When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I shared a room with my parents, and one night I was getting home late with my mom. As soon as we walked through the front door, I looked down the hallway to see a short-robed dark entity standing there, staring right at me. I couldn't see its eyes under the hoodie. Where space should be, it was all dark. I told my mom, and it disappeared by the time she looked. About a week later, as I was sleeping in the middle of the night, I felt something pulling on my leg. I woke up and looked towards the foot of my bed. This time, it wasn't wearing a hoodie. It looked like a gremlin. This happened on and off for a couple of months. When I woke up and saw it, it was because I felt something watching me. I was unable to move or scream for my parents. I would pull the blanket over my head sometimes, hoping it would just go away. Finally, one night, as it was pulling on my leg, I got the nerve to take a swing at it. It then disappeared. Every night after that I prayed, and I never saw it again. About 4 months ago, a friend of mine was telling a group at work about how he had seen a demon-like creature at the foot of his bed when he was little, and I ended up finishing the story for him. He couldn't believe it. We both had the same experiences. I still wonder if anyone else has ever experienced something like this.
True Paranormal Story number 2. The Voice.
It was about 7 p.m. and I was alone at the house. My parents were out and I was reading a book for homework. Suddenly I felt a cold chill come over me and immediately felt someone being in my house. I feared if I turned around something would try to kill me. I ran out of the room to the living room. I was beginning to calm down and tell myself that I was just being paranoid and there was no one in the house when I heard a voice whisper very close to my ear. And it sounded to me like it said,
"I'll be waiting for you."
It sounded like it was a man's voice, but it sounded dead. Needless to say, I freaked out and ran to my next door neighbor's house and told them what had happened. They said that they would come over and take a look. So my neighbor came over and looked around my house, even in the closets. My neighbor finally gave up and told me that I was probably just hearing things, and she went back home. I was still scared and stood by the front door, ready to run out if I heard anything. When my parents got home, I told them what had happened, and of course they didn't believe me. That night I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I didn't know why I had woken up, but I can recall being very frightened. I immediately felt the same freezing cold chill, and I sent someone else in the room with me. Then I heard it again. The words were more stretched out, however, and it sounded like it said,
"I'll be waiting for you."
I screamed, and my parents ran into my room. I told them what I had heard. They comforted me and told me that I probably just dreamed the voice, and they said nothing would hurt me. I finally calmed down, but I was still scared. I went back to sleep, But the next morning I woke up and sat up and noticed that something wasn't right. I looked up on my dresser and saw that my cross necklace wasn't where it should be. I got up and frantically looked around my room. I was about to give up hope when I stepped on something sharp, and I looked down and saw my beloved necklace smashed. It was in pieces, littered across the room floor. It looked like it had been coated with blood. The pieces were rusted and red. I've never heard that scary voice since that day. I truly believe I had an encounter with an evil being. Something straight from hell.
True paranormal story number 3. The Ouija board.
In the fall of 1996, my friends and I spoke of doing a Ouija board session. Skeptical as I was, I gladly accepted the opportunity. We didn't have a board, and I didn't want to drive everywhere looking for one. So my friends and I made one. It was a piece of cardboard with the lettering on it. We put the sun and the moon on the top corners also. For the planchette, we cut out a triangular piece of cardboard which had to be moved with force since it didn't slide smoothly like the one sold at stores. We lived in Huntsville, Texas, and the day we decided to do it was the same day Martin Garu, a prisoner who was on death row for murder, had escaped and had just been found dead in the river not too far from my friend's house. The house we were in was old and scary looking. We were in the middle room, which was pretty large. It could have been a second living room area, but at the time was being used for a bedroom. All 6 of us gathered around the board in the room, and the only light coming from a large candle we had. Now, all night, a couple of my friends were saying, let's talk to Martin Garu's ghost, the man who died earlier that day. So we sat around the board, and Tanner and Melissa were the only ones who were going to touch it. Tanner had never done anything like that, but Melissa claims to have witnessed how it's supposed to be done. So, they both put their hands over the planchette, and Tanner asked, are there any spirits out there tonight? The planchette moved by itself. This was very shocking because their fingers never actually touched the planchette. They were merely 2 inches above it hovering. As soon as it moved very slowly, it amazed everyone. At that point, anyone who was skeptical was now, at least, very curious. The planchette slowly moved to the word yes. From that moment, I only remember a few of the questions. I remember when Tanner asked, what is your name? It replied, I used to be Martin Garu. Then, some weird stuff happened. Tommy was sitting next to me, and he nudged me and said, did you see that? But before I could answer no, Chad, another friend, said, I saw it. Personally, I did not see anything, but later they said the left side of the planchette picked up off the board by itself and was dragging. I did see something paranormal that made me a believer to this day. You see, their fingers were on the letter T, and the planchette quickly slid over to the letter A while their fingers were still on the letter T. They got really scared and pulled their hands away after they saw that. Shane, another friend of mine, was sitting on the bed about 4 feet from the board. He told us Martin Garu went to high school in Corpus Christi, but he didn't know where as he traveled a lot as a high school student. He knew most of the schools there. Everyone else there didn't know much about Corpus Christi or knew anything about the schools there. So Tanner asked the ghost Martin, where did you go to high school? The planchette slid to R, then the letter A, and Shane's eyes watered. He moved quickly to sit right next to the board and said, no way. Then it went to the letter Y. Shane said, the Ray Texans High School. This shocked everyone. I know that they were all terrified just as I was. At this point, Tanner ran into the kitchen and turned on the light. He had goosebumps and his eyes were watering. I remembered as if it were yesterday. He said, "I'm not going back in there, Tommy. You see, the house belonged to Tommy." And Tommy said, "Well, go ask it to leave, because if there's something in here, I want it to go." So Tanner agreed. Tanner went in and asked the ghost Martin to leave. The planchette went to the word no. He asked it again, and it still replied no. He asked a third time, and it went towards the word no. Then the planchette went to the middle of the board and just sat there. It would not move again. So we went to the back porch and burned the board, while some of us smoked. When we went inside, as soon as the last person entered the kitchen and shut the door, the pots fell off the counter in the kitchen, and the pictures on the refrigerator fell to the floor. Everyone was silent. Tommy and Chase slept in the other room that night and took the deer heads off the wall. They said they didn't want them to talk to them in the middle of the night. I understand completely how the mind makes people think they see things they do not.
The doppelganger.
The story I'm about to tell you is true, and it's 100% paranormal. There is no other explanation for what occurred. This true story takes place in Bryan, Texas. I'm a single mom, and I have one daughter that's in college. She attends a college that is about 5 hours from my house. I was at home one night, and I was watching TV on the sofa, alone. It was about 12 o'clock midnight, and I was getting ready to go to bed when I heard a noise behind me. It was the front door to the house that was left open, and my daughter, who was supposed to be in college, walked past the living room and slowly went into the hallway. I called out her name, Nancy. She didn't turn around. She kept on walking, and she was wearing a red sweater with blue jeans. I remember feeling really scared and confused as to why my daughter came home without letting me know, when she's supposed to be in college 5 hours from here. I walked to the hallway and I saw her standing in front of the door to her old room. Again, she's been in college for the last 2 years, so there's no reason why she would be trying to open the door to her old room. I looked at her and said, "Nancy, what are you doing? Is everything okay? Please look at me." My heart was pounding, and all I can remember is wondering, why isn't she acknowledging me? She turned around slowly and looked at me, and she had a blank stare on her face, as if she was in a trance. She turned back towards her room, opened the door and walked in and shut it. I was puzzled and confused. At that moment, while I was standing in the hallway, the phone rang that was in the living room right next to the sofa. I walked over to the phone and picked it up. It was my daughter, the same daughter that is now in the room. My heart stopped and I couldn't breathe. I was petrified, and I went ahead and told my daughter on the phone that her ghost is actually in the house at that same moment. I told her to please stay on the line with me. Do not hang up the phone. I was petrified. I slowly walked down the hallway to my daughter's room and opened the door. The room was empty and no one was in there. It was pitch black. I closed the door and walked down the hallway back towards the living room, and when I got to the living room area, there my daughter was standing. She looked at me, but this time angrily. I told her to please get out. The entity then stared at me for a few more seconds before running towards me. I covered my face with my hands and screamed. I felt that I was going to die. When nothing happened, I slowly pulled my hands down from my face, and it was gone. This experience terrified me to the point that I have gotten my home blessed many times. I now know what I saw that night was a doppelganger of my daughter.
The party.
Back in 2007, my sister and her husband used to live with me and my mother. I was in the middle of school at the time. One Saturday night, my brother-in-law was working at a security job, and my sister and I were with my mom at a church function. These church functions lasted about 8 to 8:30, so we wouldn't get home to around 9 o'clock at night. We pulled up to our mobile home. Usually, my brother would be inside waiting for us, but instead he was outside standing by himself, looking like he had seen a ghost. We pull into the carport, and I noticed that all the lights are off inside. When we get out of the car, he lifts his hand and points at the house and says in a shaken voice, "I'm not going in there by myself." We asked him what happened, and this is what he told us. "I came home and I was walking into the carport, and I was about to enter the house. I heard what sounded like a group of people talking and laughing inside the house. I heard silverware and dishes clanking loudly, thinking like there was some sort of dinner party, but all the lights were off. I thought you guys were trying to play a prank on me or something. So I got up the steps and I pull out my house keys. The whole time I still hear muffled chatter and laughing and even music. As soon as I put the house key in the doorknob, I heard someone say, 'Shh.' Then the entire house went silent, like everything just stopped at once. As soon as I opened the door, just a little, I heard people running in the opposite direction of the trailer, away from me. At this point, I'm starting to think that it wasn't a prank, and some people have broken into the house and were trying to leave before they got caught. So I ran around the back of the house to cut them off at the back door. But once I got there, everything was quiet. I thought maybe whoever was inside didn't run out because they knew I was going to go on the other side. So I sprinted back to the front door, opened it, and ran inside. It was quiet and pitch black. I turned on all the lights and cleared the entire house looking for anyone. Not one thing was out of place. Nothing to indicate at all that anyone was there. That's when I ran outside and waited for you guys to get here. My brother-in-law was never the same after that day." This story happened in the Philippines in October of 2002 on Halloween night. This was when I was still a junior in high school. My friends and I stuck around school late one night after our annual Halloween party. We had gotten out my friend's Ouija board. It wasn't the brightest idea, but we were looking for a thrill. We found a nice spot under a tree and proceeded to set up the game. There were 5 of us. We were all expecting some kind of paranormal contact. Rumor was our school was haunted. It said that on Halloween night, the spirits come out to play, and we wanted to get scared that night. We were really excited because it was the first time any of us saw a Ouija board. Our school was located in an old Spanish mission house built in the 1800s when the Spaniards still occupied the Philippines. We were in a section of the school that no one ever went to. We sat down in the middle of an open space with only a small light bulb illuminating the surroundings. My friend, who had brought the Ouija board, proceeded to place it in the middle of the circle. It was a glow-in-the-dark version, which gave us the ability to see what was written in the dark. Not knowing exactly what to do, and going only by what we saw in the movies, we all placed our index fingers on top of the planchette, and we looked at each other and said, "What's next?" We decided to just throw out questions. "Is anyone there?" I called out from the darkness. Nothing happened. One of my friends who was there asked, "If there are any spirits here, please make yourself known." Still, nothing moved. We clearly had no idea what we were doing. One of the boys jerked the planchette, and the girl screamed, breaking the silence. Then we all laughed at how ridiculous this all was. After a bit of joking around, we decided to give it another go. We all placed our index fingers back on the planchette. Once more, we asked, "Is anyone there? We'd like to make contact." We were just about to give up when the wind started to pick up, and the darkness around us seemed to move in. I felt scared for some reason. I didn't know why. We asked again, "Is anyone there?" I remember the dead leaves beginning to swirl around us with the wind. One of the girls said that she was scared and that her mom told her not to play with forces that we do not understand. Despite being terrified, we continued to ask questions like, "Are you a ghost or are you a demon?" But still, nothing happened. "This is boring. I don't know what to do anymore," one of the girls said. Just then, a group of dogs from the neighboring house started barking at us through the chain-linked fence. These two dogs were growling and baring their teeth, going crazy. We were all petrified, and without finishing the ritual properly by saying goodbye to the board, we just got up and bolted out of there. We didn't see one another until after Halloween break. And this is where the story gets really terrifying. One of the girls told us about a weird experience she had when she went home with the Ouija board that late Halloween night. She realized that she didn't have her house key, and so she called her younger brother to let her in the house. What he said terrified her to the core. He swore she was already home and had seen her walk in a while before, and said that she looked really tired and stared at him before going upstairs to her bedroom. Then another friend told us of an encounter that she had that same Halloween night. She was going up to her room when the light started flickering as she was ascending the staircase. She assumed it was just faulty wiring, but then she saw the door to her room open and a dark figure stepped out and stood at the top of the staircase. She couldn't make out this entity, but she said that she couldn't move and felt utter dread as this thing started to go down the staircase toward her. "Something happened to me as well," said one of my other friends who was there. He recalled that he was sleeping at night in bed when he woke up feeling really uncomfortable. There was this dread and heaviness surrounding the air in the room. He looked around the room, and that's when he saw a bloody face of a woman with piercing red eyes staring right at him through the window. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because I also had an incident myself that night after playing with the Ouija board. That night, I was sleeping in the passenger seat of my mom's car on the ride home when I felt the car jerk. I woke up instantly and looked out the window and saw that we were hit by an 18-wheeler. I panicked and made it out of the car. Luckily, my mom and I survived the crash, but the front of the car was totaled. I still don't have an explanation for why all those things happened to us that same night. Thank God nothing happened after that. I have never played or gotten near a Ouija board ever since then.
The Deerhead.
We went on a camping trip and brought something back with us. About 8 or 9 years ago, me and some friends were on a camping trip. We encountered something weird in the woods that seemed to follow us home. This story is 100% true. At the time, me and my friends went camping in some private land in western Nebraska on some flat foothills around the Rockies. Late one night, when it was getting dark, we were playing airsoft on top of a plateau, a sort of zombie survival game mode that we made up. Survivors would hide. There's only certain people to shoot. The zombies searched for people to shoot, If you got shot by a zombie, then you became a zombie. The last man standing wins. Me and one friend were hiding in some tall grass near the edge of a roughly 60-foot dirt wall that was to our backs, so no one can sneak up on us. At one point, we spot a strange orb of light hovering around the area for a few seconds with fast speed. It zoomed through the sky and disappeared. We have the footage on our phones, and I made sure not to delete it. Right after we heard movement in the grass behind us, we turned around, and the grass was indented as if something was there. Like I said earlier, there's a wall behind us. It's impossible for someone to sneak up on us. And if it was an animal, we would have heard it. We kind of just blew it off. Sometimes weird stuff just happens in the middle of the woods at night. However, more strange things occurred a few days after getting home. Me and my friends had the same dreams and witnessed the same things when we woke up. In my dream, I was in the woods, scared and running from something that was chasing me. When I finally turned around to see what it was a humanoid creature with a deer head, with red glowing eyes. I woke up and it was freezing in my room. I could see my breath in the air. I got up and looked out my window, and standing right there in front of my window was a full-grown deer. It just stared at me and slowly walked away back into the woods behind my house. I've never had that happen to me before. I called my friend to ask him if anything paranormal was happening to him, and he said he just had a nightmare and he saw the same thing looking at him from his bedroom window. I know now that what happened out there was paranormal, and whatever it was did indeed follow us home.
Scary True Paranormal Story number 2. The House on Magnolia Road.
My family and I moved into a 2-story house in Oklahoma back in 1978. When some friends of the family found out we were going to buy the house on Magnolia Street, they begged my parents not to do it, warning them that it was haunted. But my father didn't believe them, so we moved in anyway. When my father was working in the yard one day, he came stomping inside angry, demanding to know why none of us were picking up my crying nephew, who was a newborn at the time. Well, we all looked at him like he was crazy, and we showed him that the baby was fast asleep. Dumbfounded, he returned to the yard, but he told us later that day that he continued to hear the baby crying in the house. As soon as he got outside, even my nephew was asleep or not home at all, my dad would always hear the baby crying. On another occasion, my dad was in the kitchen drinking coffee at the table. He looked up and saw a woman with long black hair watching him from the stairway. He knew something wasn't right. He called my mom over and she saw it too, right before the woman vanished into thin air. The kitchen was the most haunted room in the house. Another time, my mom and sister were eating at the table, and the dish rack full of dishes lifted itself up off the counter, hung in midair, and crashed to the floor, breaking everything in it. Mom said maybe the ghost didn't like dishes cluttering up the counter space. Once my mom got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. To get there from her bedroom, you had to walk through the kitchen. When she did, she saw a woman standing at the kitchen sink. My mom just ignored it, hoping the entity would leave her alone. So my mom kept her head down and continued walking to the bathroom. When she made it to the bathroom door and put her hand on the knob, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked at it, and it was a black hand with long nails. She then heard a woman's voice say,
"Hello there."
When Mom turned around, the woman disappeared right before her eyes. Only a couple of days later, my sister said she felt someone sleeping in her bed next to her. At first she thought it was one of our younger siblings crawling into bed with her, but one night something pulled the blankets off of her, and when she reached down to pull them back, She realized she was alone in the room, but she could still see an imprint in the mattress as if someone were sitting on the bed next to her. She was petrified. She closed her eyes and prayed. When she opened her eyes, the imprint was gone. Almost every night, around 3 in the morning, my mom would hear a toddler falling down the stairs, hitting the kitchen floor, and crying. She would go see what happened, and nothing was there. One time, my mom was watching TV, and she saw a cowboy standing at the back door staring at her. When she got up to see who it was, it disappeared. My parents called in a priest who blessed the house, and the paranormal occurrences would temporarily stop, but soon after would pick up all over again. The hauntings proved too much for my family, and we had to move. The house was demolished in 1988. Inside the walls, they found an 8-inch thick binder full of documents and deeds about the house and the land dating back to the 1700s. The land is vacant now, with only the seller remaining to testify that a house ever existed in the first place. I don't know about the spirits though. They may still be hanging around the area. I once took a road trip from New Hampshire to Florida. I had to stop at a hotel to sleep overnight when I was about halfway there. It was an old vintage-looking hotel that rested off the highway on a quiet road. There were 2 cars in the parking lot, so there were definitely not a lot of guests. The lady at the front desk was very robotic with her words. The lobby was full of tacky chairs and tables you'd expect to find on the curve. The wallpapers were all outdated and very old-looking. It didn't matter because I wasn't staying there for the luxury, just for the night because I was extremely sleepy. It was really late when I checked in, around 2 in the morning or so. When I got in the room, all I did was take out my toothbrush and brush my teeth before jumping into the hotel bed. I turned off the lamp next to the bed, tried to go to sleep, not looking forward to the long day of driving I had ahead of me. Right when I was about to fall asleep, there was a knock at the door. I looked at the bedside clock to see what time it was. It was exactly 3 in the morning. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. Apparently, the peephole didn't work because I couldn't see out into the hallway. It was pitch black. I looked down at the crack under the door, but didn't see any outlines of feet blocking the light. So I opened the door just a little bit to peek into the hallway. I didn't see anyone standing in front of the door. I opened it fully and then peeked down both sides of the hallway. It was clear, so I had to suddenly question if someone in this relatively vacant hotel was pranking me. I shut the door and locked it with the bolt this time. I went to lay back down in the bed, but then it happened again, banging on the door. This time, I jumped out of the bed, ran to the door, and checked the peephole again. Shockingly, all I saw was the empty hallway outside, but it hit me this time. I could actually see through the peephole. I unbolted the door and opened it. No one was there. I looked down both sides of the hallway again. There was no one. I could feel as if something was watching me. The hairs on my arms were standing straight up. This was where I drew the line. I grabbed the key to the room and went to the lady at the front desk. I told her someone kept knocking on my hotel door. I asked her to check the cameras to see who it could be. She replied they didn't have cameras in the hallways. The reaction also wasn't what I was hoping for. She seemed very unconcerned with what I told her. She said in a calm voice, there was only one other guest in the whole building. Then she just stared blankly at me. I could tell she wouldn't be of any help with this problem. So I left her and went back to my room. I locked the door with the bolt again. This time, I put on my headphones and put on one of those 5-hour sleep relaxation videos on YouTube. This would not only help me get to sleep, but block out any noise that I would hear coming from outside the room. It worked for a while. Eventually, I flipped from my side to my back and looked around the room. Then I froze with fear. I was staring at the corner and sat up to try to get a closer look at what I thought I was seeing. It looked like a giant humanoid figure, about 10 foot tall, standing right in the corner with its head to the ceiling. It was all pitch black. When I put the image together in my head, I felt a sudden rush of horror in my body. I quickly turned on the lamp, but when the room lit up, there was nothing in the corner of the room. I simply sat there with my heart beating probably 180 beats per minute. I gave myself a couple of minutes to calm down before shutting the light back off and laying back down on my side. I put the headphones in my ears, playing the relaxation video, and it really did help. I calmed down a little bit more, and not even 2 minutes later, as I looked in the corner of the room, it looked to be the 10-foot tall humanoid figure standing there looking straight at me again. I crawled to the edge of the bed and looked closer, and I practically shit myself. I saw what I was sure was a long arm at the side moving. I dove to turn on the lamp again, and the corner was empty again. I didn't stick around that time. I bagged up my few things in a matter of seconds and left the room. I gave the key to the woman and said I'm checking out early. She didn't even say a word as I stormed out the front door of the hotel. I then continued driving until I found another hotel where I fell fast asleep with no supernatural disturbances. Scary, true, paranormal story number 2. As a kid, I had a bedroom on the first floor. Money was a little tight, and my mom was taking care of 4 kids. I was the youngest, so I had the little room. My room was next to the living room, a small square room with wood flooring. There were 2 big vents in the floor in this room and 2 opposite corners. My bed took up half of the room. Like I said, it was very small. I was 13 years old doing my homework on my bed since I didn't have a desk in my room. When I heard a child's laughter, I freaked out. I went outside my room to look around the living room and kitchen for any of my siblings that must have been playing around. Everyone was upstairs asleep. I definitely heard that laughter. There's no way I could have imagined it. I continued my homework, but with one ear listening for any other suspicious sounds. Eventually, enough time passed that I was able to move past it. In fact, it seems it was just about when I was able to get over it, I heard it again. Kids giggling. It was louder, and this time it went on longer. It wasn't coming from outside my room. It was somewhere in the room. I figured one of my brothers was hiding from me. I followed the sound of laughter strangely to the corner of my room. I then looked down at the vent on the floor. That's when I figured out it was coming from inside the vent. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear up to the vent. There was no more giggling at this point. When there was a silence for a few seconds, I lifted my ear from the vent and then put my eyes up to the vent to get a peek inside it. It took me a second to realize I was staring at a pair of red glowing eyes looking back up at me. It opened its mouth and made a low growl. I jumped back to the wall and screamed for my mom in tears. She came storming into my room seconds later, but of course the noises were gone, as were the eyes. My mom thought I was going crazy due to a lack of sleep. I refused to sleep in that room that night, so she let me sleep in her room that night. This went on for a couple of weeks before she put her foot down and forced me to continue sleeping in my own room. We eventually moved a year later, and nothing paranormal ever happened since then.
This true story took place when I was in the 2nd grade. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. I was playing in my backyard with my dog Rome. She was a boxer. My parents weren't home at the time. My sister was watching me at the time. As I was playing with my dog, I began to notice that she was becoming more aggressive. She then started attacking me and biting me. I was trying to run away, but Rome kept attacking me. My sister heard me screaming outside and ran outside to pull me inside the house. I was petrified. I thought my dog was going to kill me. My sister told me to stay inside the house. I listened to her. Paranormal events started happening shortly after that day. There are just too many to recount every single one, but the one that stuck out more than the rest occurred about a year after the incident with my dog Rome. My sister was alone in her room, while my parents and I were downstairs watching television. According to my sister, there was a knock at her door. She then asked, "Who is it?" The knocking grew louder. She then asked again, "Who is it?" But the only reply she received was the knocking getting worse and worse. My sister thought it was me pranking her. She screamed out for me to stop. Suddenly, the pounding on the door became unbearably loud and the door started to give way. That's when my sister rushed over to brace the door. She then heard a demonic voice say,
"Come out here and play."
My sister fell to the floor and screamed out, "Please, Jesus, help me." The banging suddenly stopped and a chilling noise was heard on the other side of the door as the dark presence fled away from the area. Now, fast forward 5 years later, on the day after my sister's 18th birthday, she moved out into an apartment. I assisted her with moving her things into her car. As she drove off to drop the first load off at her apartment, I decided to do some snooping around. I found one of her diaries that she kept when she was younger. That's where I made the chilling discovery of how it all began. I flipped through some of the pages and found an entry when my sister was in the 5th grade. She went on a week-long field trip. One of my sister's classmates had brought a Ouija board. They encouraged my sister to partake and play along. She became fascinated with the board and even asked her friend to teach her how to make one. When she got home the following week, she constructed her own Ouija board. After playing around with it for a while, the demonic spirit that was bound to the board told her that it must take a sacrifice and that it had chosen someone. It chose me, her brother. She panicked and threw the board away. After reading this, I came to the realization that the demonic entity that my sister had foolishly conjured likely possessed my dog to try to hurt or kill me. This was a lot for me to process at the time, knowing that I had almost died at the hands of a demonic force. Apparently, my sister had confessed to my mother about this shortly after this paranormal event began to occur. My sister had moved all of her stuff out of the house, and my mother told me about the Ouija board and confirmed that everything was indeed true. We lived in that haunted house for another 4 years before moving to my current home, and it's been almost 7 years now, and I haven't had any more encounters since living in that house. The evil entity has left my family alone. Although we live in peace, I still get chills looking back on everything we had to go through in that haunted house.
Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, The Tatum's Ghost.
Jim and Kay Tatum are reliable and respectable people. Jim was a carrier army officer and Kay was an accountant. But in their new home, they've experienced unexplained sounds and objects that moved for no apparent reason. In a suburb near Atlanta, Georgia, where Jim and Kay Tatum built a new home, there they planned to retire. But 5 months after they moved in, the Tatums began to experience unnatural events that forced them to put their house up for sale. One night in January of 1986, Kay Tatum woke up from a restless sleep, not wanting to disturb her husband. She left their room. She went to the restroom and left the restroom door open. She then sensed a strange presence. She saw a glimpse of a man walking past the open doorway. Kay thought it might have been her husband, Jim. She called out to Jim, yet no answer came. She then went to bed, and there was her husband, Jim, asleep in the bed. At that point, she thought it was a burglar. Jim searched the whole house, and there was no evidence of any entry, nor any evidence of anyone having been in the house. Jim thought that maybe they were starting to have an overactive imagination. After Kay's first experience, 2 months passed by without incident. Then one dark night, Jim was repairing a ladder that led up to the attic. His work was interrupted when Kay called him for dinner. That's when Jim unplugged his drill and went downstairs to eat dinner. As it got late, Jim wanted to watch a movie, and Kay decided to go upstairs and read a book. 1 hour later, Kay heard the sound of the drill outside her room. She thought that Jim was teasing her about having seen a ghost, and she tried to ignore the noise. Eventually, she went into the hallway and noticed that it was empty, and the drill lay there on the floor unplugged. At that point, she became really frightened. That's when she reached down and felt the drill. It was ice cold. It had not been turned on for a while. Another night, Kay heard the sound of coins falling in a bowl, but she was alone in the room. Also, another time, while cooking, Kay felt 2 sharp tugs pull on her blouse. She quickly turned around to find no one there. After that incident, Kay knew she positively had a problem in the house. She knew the problem could not be understood nor explained, but that there was something definitely going on. In February of that year, Jim finally had his first experience. It started with this small angel bell located in the guest room. Jim had a habit of waking up hours before his wife. When Kay woke up, she would ring the bell if she needed him upstairs. Jim had grown used to climbing the stairs after hearing the bell. One day, the bell rang. Jim went upstairs to see what Kay needed. Yet, when he made it to the room, Kay was asleep. Jim looked at the bell and thought he must have heard something else other than the bell. But after the 3rd time of the bell ringing and it not being Kay, the couple decided to make up a code in order to outwit the entity that was hearing. Jim secretly told Kay in her ear at the breakfast table, "If the angel bell rings 3 times, I'll come on up the stairs and I'll know it's you." So the next time it rang 3 times. Jim then knew for sure this time it was Kay, because this was their signal. Jim slowly walked up the stairs into Kay's room. To his surprise and shock, she was sound asleep. Jim looked around the room, and the bell was not even in Kay's room. It was located in the other bedroom where it stays. Jim then went in the other bedroom where the bell was. He picked it up, wondering how it was able to ring by itself. Jim then turned around and began to walk out of the room. But before he could leave the doorway, the bell rang again behind his back. Petrified, Jim left the room, and the following day, the Tatums got rid of the angel bell. Jim later revealed that this was a turning point in his life that made him also a believer in the paranormal, just as his wife Kay. The Tatums that year were not comfortable living the remainder of their lives in that haunted house. They eventually moved, leaving behind whatever was haunting them.